Imagine standing on a sun-warmed cliff somewhere along the northern coast of Australia, looking out across an ocean that has not yet swallowed the land beyond it. The horizon stretches further than it does today, and the sea has retreated to expose a vast plain of red earth and silver rivers that no modern map remembers. You are looking at a country that no longer exists, walked by people whose names were forgotten so completely that even the rocks have stopped whispering them. Tonight, we are going to walk through that lost country together. We will follow the trail of a civilization that may have lived on this continent before the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians arrived. A people who left behind paintings older than the pyramids, stones arranged in patterns no one can explain, and stories that survive only as quiet echoes in the deep dreaming of the land. Some say they were giants. Some say they came from the sea. Some say they were here long before anyone else, and that they simply faded away without leaving us their name. What we do know is this: the deeper anyone looks into the most remote corners of Australia, the stranger the evidence becomes, and the harder it gets to dismiss the idea that this continent has a secret older than memory itself. So tonight, let us walk slowly, let us speak softly, let us turn over the stones one by one and see what waits beneath them. Before we begin this long, quiet walk through the oldest mysteries of Australia, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a small comment below telling us where you're listening from tonight. Your presence here matters more than you know. Now settle in, breathe slowly, let your shoulders fall, and let your mind sink into the deep silence of the southern continent as we begin. Number 1. The paintings that should not exist. In the rugged sandstone country of the Kimberley region, in the far northwest of Western Australia, there is a body of rock art unlike anything else found anywhere on the continent. The local Aboriginal people call these images Gwion Gwion, though they are more widely known to the wider world as the Bradshaw paintings, named after a pastoralist who first reported them to outsiders in 1891. They depict slender, elegant human figures wearing what appear to be tassels, sashes, headdresses, and ornamental belts. Some carry boomerangs and spears, some seem to be dancing, some are arranged in long ceremonial processions that move across the rock face as though caught mid-step in a ritual that ended thousands upon thousands of years ago. The figures are painted with a delicacy and refinement that has unsettled archaeologists since the day they were first photographed properly. The detail in the clothing, the proportions of the bodies, the careful posture of each figure, all of it suggests an artistic tradition that was already mature, already polished, already old when these particular images were laid down. The strange thing is that these paintings are not made in the style associated with later Aboriginal rock art. They are different in technique, different in subject, and different in mood. Many of the Gwion Gwion images appear to have been painted with such fine brushes and such steady hands that the paint itself has fossilized into the rock, fusing with the sandstone in a process that geologists do not fully understand. Some of these images have been provisionally dated to more than 17,000 years before the present, and there are researchers who believe certain panels may be considerably older than that. We are talking about a body of art that may predate the last ice age, painted by people whose names are gone, whose language is gone, whose stories survive only in the silent gestures of figures on a stone wall in a country that almost no one ever visits. Aboriginal elders in the Kimberley have spoken openly about these paintings for generations. Many of them say that the Gwion Gwion were not made by their direct ancestors. They speak of an earlier people, sometimes called the bird people, who they say lived in the country long before the first songlines were laid down. According to some traditions, these earlier inhabitants pecked the first images into the rock using small birds with sharp beaks, and the figures themselves are said to walk in their own way, holding the memory of a world that has otherwise been completely forgotten. Whether one chooses to read these traditions as poetic memory or as a literal account of cultural succession, the basic point remains the same. The people who live in the Kimberley today, whose own roots in the land are themselves staggeringly deep, are telling us in their own words that someone else was here first. What makes the mystery deeper is the question of where the Gwion artists actually came from. Some researchers have noted that their dress, their headgear, and their bodily proportions look unusual for what we expect of early Australian populations. Comparisons have been drawn cautiously to certain ancient peoples of Southeast Asia, to early figures painted on the walls of caves in Indonesia, and even to certain Sahara cultures that flourished when North Africa was still a fertile grassland, and the desert had not yet swallowed everything green. None of these comparisons proves anything, but they do open the door to a thought that mainstream archaeology has historically been reluctant to entertain. The first artists of the Kimberley may not have been the ancestors of the people who later inherited the country. They may have been an earlier wave, perhaps far earlier, who came, who lived, who painted these astonishing scenes, and who then quietly disappeared, leaving only their elegant figures behind on the warm stone. And so we stand at the foot of a Kimberley escarpment, in the warm air of a late afternoon, the sandstone glowing red and gold around us, looking up at a procession of slender figures who once moved with such grace across the stone that even time has not quite been able to erase them. We do not know their language. We do not know what they were celebrating. We do not know what they called themselves or what they called the country they walked through. We only know that they were here and that they painted and that they left behind a question that grows larger every time someone looks at it carefully. The figures stare back at us from the stone, calm, dignified, unbothered by the centuries that have flowed past them. They are still dancing even now in the quiet of the Kimberley afternoon. Number 2, the pyramid in the rainforest. In southeast Queensland, not far from a small town called Gympie, there is a story that refuses to die. According to local accounts that go back to the 1870s, there once stood a stepped stone structure rising out of the dense subtropical bush, a hill of carefully placed stones arranged in tiers, each tier set back from the one below it, climbing up the slope in a deliberate and unmistakable shape. Settlers who saw it called it the Gympie Pyramid, and they reported that it stood roughly 100 feet high, with terraced sides covered in vines and tropical undergrowth. There are old photographs, somewhat blurry, that appear to show some of these terraces. There are reports of stone walls running through the surrounding forest. There are even accounts of carved stone figures and small artifacts that were said to have come from the site, some bearing markings that locals could not identify. The site itself, if it ever existed in the form described, has been almost entirely destroyed. Quarrying, agricultural development, and the rapid clearing of land in the early 20th century reshaped the hill until very little of the original structure remained, assuming there was a structure there in the first place. Mainstream archaeology has been firm on this point. There is no Gympie pyramid. What the settlers saw was a natural hill that had been partially terraced by Italian banana farmers in the early 1900s. The carved figures where they have been found are dismissed as either misidentified natural stones or as relatively modern artifacts. The stone walls in this bush are described as ordinary colonial era farm walls. End of story. And yet the story refuses to end. Local researchers, amateur historians, and a steady trickle of independent investigators have continued to dig into the question for more than a century. They point to old newspaper accounts that describe the pyramid in detail decades before the Italian farmers arrived. They point to oral traditions from local Aboriginal people who reportedly described the site as a place of older people, a place to be avoided, a place that belonged to those who came before. They point to small statues that turned up in the area, including one well-known figure that some have argued resembles a Hindu deity or an ancient Egyptian-style funerary figurine. They point to the simple fact that the area sits along an old trade and travel corridor that may have seen visitors from far away long before European settlement. The Gympie Pyramid, in other words, has become something more than a place. It has become an idea. It is the idea that somewhere beneath the tangled roots of an Australian rainforest, there might be the remains of a structure that does not fit the story we have been told about this continent. It is the idea that visitors from somewhere across the seas, perhaps Southeast Asian seafarers, perhaps Egyptian or Phoenician traders following the trade winds, perhaps a people we have no name for at all, came to this stretch of coast and built something that endured for a long time before quietly crumbling back into the forest. Walking through the hills around Gympie today, you would not know anything unusual had ever been there. The bush has reclaimed everything. The terraces, if they were ever real, are buried under decades of growth. The carved stones, if they ever existed, are scattered or lost. The site has become a kind of ghost, more powerful in its absence than it ever was in its presence. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of the whole story. We may never know whether there really was a pyramid in the Queensland rainforest. We may never know who built it, or when, or why. We only know that the story has refused to fade, that it has been carried forward by generation after generation of people who insist that they saw it, or that their grandparents saw it, or that their elders spoke of it. And somewhere out there, perhaps still under the ground, the stones may be waiting. Number 3, the hieroglyphs that were not supposed to be there. About 50 miles north of Sydney, in a quiet patch of bushland near the small town of Carryong, in the area known to locals as Gosford, there is a narrow sandstone gully tucked between two ridges. The gully is not on any tourist map. There are no signs leading to it. The track in is rough and unmarked. But for more than 50 years, this small ravine has drawn a steady stream of visitors because carved into the soft sandstone walls on either side, there are roughly 250 figures arranged in vertical columns, and at first glance, they appear to be Egyptian hieroglyphs. The figures include what look like falcons, jackals, eyes, ankhs, scarabs, snakes, and royal cartouches, along with rows of geometric symbols that have an unmistakably ancient appearance. Some of them are quite weathered, others are surprisingly crisp. They run along the rock walls for many yards in long, methodical sequences, as though someone with knowledge of the script had stood in this quiet Australian gully and patiently carved an entire inscription into the stone. There are several names that appear, including one cartouche that some researchers have read as belonging to a son of an Egyptian pharaoh, lost on an expedition many thousands of years ago. The official position is straightforward. The Gosford glyphs are a modern hoax. They are most likely the work of one or more individuals, possibly soldiers stationed nearby during the Second World War, or amateurs in the 1920s and 30s who were inspired by the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun and decided to leave their mark on the local sandstone. The carvings, according to mainstream Egyptologists who have examined photographs of them, contain inconsistencies, mixed periods, errors in proportion, and modern interpretive choices that no ancient Egyptian scribe would have made. The site in this view is a curiosity, an elaborate forgery, an Australian footnote in the global history of pseudo-archaeology, but the story will not lie still. Independent researchers have spent decades documenting the glyphs, photographing them in different lighting conditions, comparing them to known inscriptions, interviewing elderly locals who claim the carvings were there long before the Second World War. Some have argued that the weathering patterns on certain glyphs are inconsistent with a recent origin, that the deepest carvings show levels of erosion that should require centuries, perhaps thousands of years to accumulate. Others have pointed to local Aboriginal traditions that reportedly speak of pale-skinned visitors from across the Northern Sea, who came in long ships and left markings on the rocks. There are even claims that certain elders have always known of the site, and that it is considered a place of foreign spirits, a place to be respected but not lingered in. What makes the Gosford glyphs so compelling, regardless of their actual origin, is the question they force us to ask. If they are a hoax, who exactly was the hoaxer? And how did they manage to carve such a large body of work so deeply into the rock in a remote bush gully without anyone noticing? If they are real, what on earth would Egyptian hieroglyphs be doing in a sandstone valley north of Sydney, several thousand years before any conventional history says such a thing could have happened? Both possibilities are extraordinary. Both demand explanations that we do not currently have. And so, as the late afternoon light filters down into the Carrion Gully, you can stand among those carved figures and feel something quiet rising out of the sandstone. The falcons stare back at you. The eyes follow you. The geometric symbols keep their secrets. Whether they were carved 50 years ago or 50 centuries ago, they are now part of the landscape, part of the long Australian conversation about who was here and when, and what they were doing, and why their traces will not stop appearing in places where, according to the official story, they should not be at all. Number 4. The giant figure carved into the desert. In the dry country of South Australia, far from any town, far from any road, lies a place called Finnis Springs. The land here is flat, red, and immensely old. Salt lakes stretch out in pale crusts under a sky that seems too large for any single horizon to hold. In 1998, an aircraft flying over this remote area spotted something extraordinary etched into the ground. A vast figure of a man carved into the desert surface, more than 2.5 miles long from head to foot. The figure stood with one arm raised, holding what appeared to be a hunting stick or a thrown weapon. Its proportions were almost perfect. Its outline was so precise that it could only be properly appreciated from the air. The figure became known as the Marri Man, named after the small town nearest to the site, and it set off one of the strangest and most enduring archaeological puzzles in modern Australian history. Nobody came forward to claim responsibility. No tracks led to or from the site. No traces of construction equipment were found nearby. The lines of the figure, which were carved into the hard desert crust to a depth of about 12 inches, were geometrically smooth, as though they had been laid out by someone with access to surveying technology and a deep understanding of large-scale design. Now, in fairness, almost everyone agrees that the Maori man is a modern creation. It is too precise, too recent-looking, and too carefully aligned to be anything else. There are theories about who made it, ranging from a publicity stunt by an unknown artist to a quiet project carried out by people with access to military mapping equipment. There is even an anonymous letter that arrived shortly after the discovery, written in a deliberately formal and almost archaic style, hinting at the figure's significance and quoting from an obscure Aboriginal mythology that no scholar has been able to verify. The whole affair has the flavor of a riddle that someone was eager for the world to notice. But what makes the Maori man fascinating in the context of our deeper question is not the figure itself. It is the fact that the figure draws our attention to a country where huge marks on the land have always been part of the story. The salt lakes around Maori are crossed by ancient pathways that you can still see from the air. The hills are dotted with stone arrangements whose purpose nobody understands. The old dreaming tracks of the Arabana and the Diari peoples thread across this landscape in lines that match no known road and respect no modern boundary. The country itself remembers more than its modern inhabitants do. Walking through that country at night under a sky so full of stars that you can read the ground by their light alone, you start to feel that the land here has been etched and marked and patterned for a very long time by hands we no longer know. There is a slightly older mystery in the same general region, less famous but more revealing. Out in the western deserts, near the Great Salt Lake known as Lake Eyre, there are arrangements of stones that have been documented since the 1860s. Some of them form rings, some of them form spiral patterns, some of them stretch in long, straight lines across the dunes, lines that point toward astronomical alignments that match certain rising stars during certain seasons. These stone patterns are not random. They have been deliberately laid out, in many cases by people who understood the movement of the heavens. The Aboriginal peoples whose country includes these arrangements often describe them as the work of ancestors so distant that even the dreaming stories no longer name them clearly. They are spoken of as the old people, the ones who walked the country before, the ones whose ceremonies are no longer remembered in full. Some of these stone arrangements are estimated to be many thousands of years old. Some may be considerably older. They sit out there in the dry red country, quietly aligning with the stars season after season, waiting for someone to look up and notice. The Maori man is almost certainly modern. The stone arrangements around Lake Eyre are almost certainly very ancient. Between those two extremes lies the long, patient story of human beings, making large marks on the Australian landscape, in patterns that we are only beginning to understand. Tonight, as we drift across the empty desert in our imagination, we can sense the figures beneath us, the lines, the circles, the spirals, the alignments. The land remembers. Whether we can read its memory or not is another question entirely. Number 5, the maps that should not exist. In a museum in Istanbul, there is a fragment of an old map. It was drawn in the early 16th century by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, who used a collection of older charts that had come into his possession to compile a single map of the world as he understood it. The map shows the coast of South America. It shows the coast of West Africa. It even shows a strange southern landmass that some researchers have argued resembles the coast of Antarctica beneath the ice. But what is less well known is that there is another tradition of old maps that hints at something even stranger. There are old Portuguese and Dieppe school maps from the early 1500s that appear to show a large landmass in roughly the position where Australia would later be found, decades and even a century before the official European discovery of the continent. The Dieppe maps, named after the French port from which many of them came, depict a large land called Java la Grande to the south of the East Indies. On these maps, the coastline of Java la Grande has features that match certain stretches of the actual Australian coast with surprising accuracy. Some scholars argue that this is a coincidence or a confused rendering of Java or other known islands. Others argue that Portuguese sailors had quietly reached and partially charted the Australian coast as early as the 1520s, and that their secret maps eventually filtered into the French cartographic tradition through copying and theft. But the Dieppe maps are only one strand of the puzzle. There are other, much older, much stranger accounts. Chinese records from the Song and Ming dynasties refer to a great southern land that lay beyond the southern islands, a land of red earth and strange animals, a land where the trees never lost their leaves and where the seasons ran backward. Some of these accounts include descriptions of plants and animals that match the Australian flora and fauna, with unsettling specificity. There are claims of bronze artifacts found in the north of Australia that may be of Chinese origin, including a small statue that allegedly turned up in the 1870s, and that some researchers have argued belongs to the Ming dynasty or earlier. There are also Arabic and Persian accounts, mostly fragmentary, that speak of southern lands reached by traders along the Indian Ocean routes. There are traditions in Sri Lanka and southern India of voyages to a continent far to the southeast where strange black peoples lived. There are even hints, mostly in the form of disputed inscriptions and reinterpreted texts, that ancient Phoenician and Egyptian traders may have reached the northern Australian coast, or that knowledge of such a coast existed in the eastern Mediterranean as far back as antiquity. None of this proves that Australia was known to the outside world long before European contact, but it does suggest that the continent may not have been quite as isolated as the standard story insists. And if outsiders did reach it, even rarely, even briefly, then the question of what they found there becomes more interesting. They would not have found an empty land. They would have found people and trade and cultures, and perhaps the remnants of older cultures still half visible in the landscape, in the stories, in the ruins. If we want to be cautious, we can say this: we do not know for certain who reached Australia before the official European discovery. We do not know what they reported. We do not know whose hands held those quiet, half-forgotten maps in the courts and trading houses of distant empires. But we know that the maps existed. We know that the Dieppe charts show a southern continent in roughly the right place, drawn with details that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. And we know that somewhere along the long, slow flow of human knowledge, there is a current that is always whispered of the great southern land long before any English sailor planted a flag on a beach near Sydney. Tonight, as you lie in the dark, imagine an old map drawn on parchment by a cartographer in a candlelit chamber in Dieppe in the 1540s. He traces a coast that he has never seen, based on charts that he has been told never to mention. He inks in the name Java La Grande in careful copperplate, then sets down his pen and looks out the window at the cold northern French rain. He does not know what waits on that southern coast. He does not know who lives there, who lived there before, who built whatever may be quietly crumbling beneath the warm sand of a continent he will never visit. He only knows that he has been told to draw the land, and that the land is real, and that someone, somewhere, has seen it with their own eyes. Number 6. The bones that broke the timeline. In 1969, in a quiet stretch of dry country in southwestern New South Wales, a geologist named Jim Bowler was walking along the shore of an ancient dry lake bed when he noticed something pale weathering out of the sand. He bent down. He brushed away the soil. He found the partial remains of a human skeleton, charred in places, carefully placed in what appeared to be a deliberate burial position. The site was named after the lake on whose shore the remains had been found, Lake Mungo. The skeleton became known to the world as Mungo Lady, and a few years later, the same area produced a second, even more complete burial, known as Mungo Man. These were not ordinary finds. They were among the oldest human remains ever discovered in Australia. They had been carefully buried. Mungo Lady had been cremated. Mungo Man had been laid out with his hands crossed over his lap, his body sprinkled with red ochre that had been carried from a source many miles away. Whoever buried him had performed something that we would today recognize as a ritual. They had cared about him. They had wanted to mark his passing. They had set him down with the same kind of solemn attention that we associate with the oldest known burials anywhere in the world. The first dates produced for Mungo Man were astonishing. Early estimates placed his burial at around 28,000 years ago. Later research pushed that figure back to 40,000, then perhaps as much as 60,000 or more. Some researchers, working with refined techniques, have argued for ages closer to 62,000 years before the present. If those higher estimates are correct, then Mungo Man and his people were already living in the interior of Australia, at a time when modern humans had only just begun to spread out of Africa into the wider world. He was already conducting ceremonial burials when much of the planet was still being explored by our species for the first time. The implications were huge. They suggested that Australia had been settled far earlier than mainstream archaeology had been willing to accept. They suggested that whoever Mungo Man's people were, they had developed complex symbolic and ceremonial life at a remarkably early stage. And they raised, very quietly, an even larger question. If people were already living in southeastern Australia 60,000 or more years ago, and if the journey across the seas from Southeast Asia required boats and navigation skills that did not appear elsewhere in the world until much later, then how exactly did they get here? Who taught them to build such boats? Who taught them to read the stars over an unknown sea? Who taught them how to survive on a continent that had never seen a human footprint before? There is a further wrinkle. The early genetic analyses of Mungo Man, performed in the early 2000s, produced results that startled some researchers. They suggested that his mitochondrial DNA did not fit neatly into the lineages of modern Aboriginal Australians, and that his closest genetic relatives might be a much older, perhaps now extinct human population. These early results were later challenged. Other analyses argued that the original samples had been contaminated and that Mungo Man's DNA actually fits comfortably within the broader Aboriginal lineage. The debate became technical, fractious, and politically delicate. But the original suggestion, however controversial, raised a thought that we cannot easily put down. What if the first inhabitants of Australia were not the direct ancestors of today's Aboriginal peoples? What if there were earlier people here who arrived first, who lived here for tens of thousands of years, and who were eventually absorbed, replaced, or simply faded away as later waves of human migration arrived from the north? This is not a comfortable question. It runs against the established narrative on multiple fronts. It is also, by the standards of mainstream genetics, probably wrong in its strongest form. But the bones of Mungo Man and Mungo Lady have done something that no theory can undo. They have shown us that the timeline of human presence in Australia is older, deeper, and stranger than anyone realized 50 years ago. They have shown us that the first Australians, whoever they were already practicing the ceremonies of a fully human spiritual life when much of the rest of our species was still finding its way. They have shown us that the dust of this continent holds memories that we are only beginning to read. Today, the remains of Mungo Man have been returned to his country, and he rests once again in the soft soil along the shore of the lake where he was first laid down. The lake is dry now. The wind moves over the dunes. The sky stretches endlessly overhead. And somewhere beneath that warm earth, the bones of a man who was buried with such tender care so long ago continue to keep their secrets, while the questions he raised continue to grow. Number 7. The figures in the sky. In the Kimberley, on the same red sandstone walls where the Gwion Gwion paintings move in their silent dances, there is another kind of figure that has been painted with a different hand. These are the Wandjina, and they are not slender, not graceful, not delicate. They are large, frontal, almost staring images of beings with great round white faces, deep dark eyes, no mouths, and what appear to be elaborate halos or radiating headdresses around their heads. The Wandjina are sacred figures in the traditions of the Warora, Ngarin Yin, and Wunumbal peoples, and they are considered to be the spirits of the clouds, the rain, the lightning, and the creation of the world. The traditional understanding is that the Wandjina were the great creator beings who shaped the country in the dreaming, who brought the first rain, who set down the laws by which the people would live. They are repainted in certain ceremonial cycles by initiated custodians, in a tradition that may stretch back many thousands of years. But many visitors who see Wandjina images for the first time have remarked on a strange resemblance. The large heads, the great staring eyes, the absence of mouths, the radiating headdresses, these features remind some viewers of nothing so much as the descriptions of unknown beings that appear in much later traditions from very different parts of the world. The temptation when one encounters the Wandjina is to leap immediately to extravagant theories, visitors from elsewhere, beings descended from the sky, the lost gods of a civilization that vanished. The popular literature on so-called ancient mysteries has often seized on the Wandjina as a kind of trophy image, presenting them as evidence for outlandish ideas that the traditional custodians of this art would find offensive and absurd. So let us put those theories to one side. They tell us more about the imaginations of certain 20th century writers than they do about anything ancient or genuine. What remains when we set aside the more sensational interpretations is still extraordinary. The Wandjina are old. The tradition of painting them is ancient. The custodians repaint certain figures, but they do so within a framework of rules and ceremonies that goes back into deep antiquity. The original Wandjina figures, whoever first painted them, were drawing the faces of beings who were considered to have created the entire world. The artistic choice to give them huge white faces, vast dark eyes, no mouths, and radiating heads is striking precisely because there is no obvious natural origin for such an image. There is no animal that looks like that. There is no human face that looks like that. The image is, in a meaningful sense, an invention, a vision, a glimpse of something that the original artists felt they had seen or been shown or were trying to remember. What were they remembering? Some researchers have suggested that the Wandjina are stylized images of monsoon clouds, with their dark eye-like centers and their bright halo edges, which would make sense for spirits associated with rain and storms. Others have suggested that they are connected to ritual masks once worn by ceremonial leaders, masks that may have been carved or painted to represent ancestral beings. Others, more speculatively, have wondered whether the Wandjina images preserve a very ancient memory of contact with a different kind of people. Perhaps people who arrive from elsewhere with strange clothing or strange appearance, and who became absorbed over time into the creator stories of the country. We cannot know. The Wandjina belong to the people whose country they were painted in, and they remain living spiritual presences for those communities today. What we can say is that they sit on the same Kimberley sandstone as the Gwion figures, in some cases on the same rock shelters, sometimes overpainted, sometimes painted nearby. They represent a different artistic tradition, a different style, a different theological vocabulary, and they raise in their own way the question of cultural layers. There were Gwion artists, there were Wandjina artists, there were the painters of countless other styles that overlap and intersect across the rock shelters of the Kimberley. Whose hands came first? Whose hands came last? And what happened in the long quiet of the country between the laying down of one tradition and the laying down of the next? Looking up at a Wandjina figure on a sandstone wall in the gentle light of a Kimberley dusk, you feel small. The figure is calm, vast, slightly remote, watching you with its great dark eyes from above the time of names. It is not waiting for you to understand it. It has been there for far longer than you can imagine, and it will be there long after you are gone. The country breathes quietly around it. Somewhere in the distance, the first stars are coming out. Number 8, the stories of the first people. In every part of Australia, in every Aboriginal nation whose oral traditions have been recorded, there are stories about the people who came before. These are not always the same stories. Different countries remember different ancestors. Different languages preserve different names. But certain themes appear again and again with such regularity that they become impossible to ignore. There are stories about earlier inhabitants who were not quite the same as today's people. There are stories about giants. There are stories about small people, hairy people, pale people, people who came from across the sea, people who fell from the sky, people who were already in the country when the first ancestors of the present nations arrived. Among the Dieri and the Wankanguru peoples of Central Australia, there are accounts of an older race of beings who lived in the country before the present human inhabitants. These earlier people are sometimes described as physically very large, sometimes as having strange habits, sometimes as having vanished without leaving a clear trail. They are spoken of in tones that suggest the storyteller is reaching across a long distance, trying to describe something that has been carried in tradition for so many generations that the original outlines have softened. The tone is respectful but cautious, as though the older people are not entirely safe to talk about. In other parts of the country, there are stories about small, hairy people who lived in the forests and the rocky places. These small people are usually described as living apart from human society, sometimes shy, sometimes dangerous. In Tasmania, the Palawa peoples preserved stories of beings called the Ray, who lived in the gullies and the deep bush, and who could occasionally be seen at dusk or at dawn. In northern Queensland, there were traditions of Yaris and similar beings, small and quick and rarely glimpsed. Such stories are often dismissed as folklore, but folklore is itself a record. It is a memory that has been kept alive in language, ceremony, and song for periods of time that we can only estimate. There are also stories of pale-skinned visitors. In several northern Australian traditions, there are accounts of strange visitors arriving from across the sea long before European contact. Men with pale skin who came in long boats and left items behind, items that became sacred objects in the local ceremonies. Some of these traditions have been linked to known historical contacts with Macassan traders from what is now Indonesia, who fished the Trepang along the northern coast for several hundred years before European arrival. But other traditions seem to describe earlier and stranger encounters with people whose origins were not from any known trading partner. What we are dealing with when we listen to these stories is one of the oldest libraries of human memory in the world. Aboriginal oral traditions in Australia have been carried forward, with remarkable fidelity in some cases, for periods that may exceed 40,000 years. There are stories that appear to preserve memories of events such as the rising of the sea at the end of the last ice age, the eruption of volcanoes that have long since gone dormant, and the existence of land bridges that have now been underwater for 10,000 years or more. If the traditions can carry such memories, then it becomes worth asking whether they also carry memories of earlier people, of cultural layers older than the present one, of encounters and successions that took place long before any written record began. The honest answer is that we do not know how to read these stories with confidence. They are not history in the sense that we usually mean it. They are something deeper and more elusive. They are condensed memory, encoded in song, in dance, in the layout of country, in the rules of behavior at certain places. Outsiders have often misunderstood them or misused them, or simply failed to listen carefully. The custodians of these traditions have not always been willing to share them for very good reasons. What they have shared, when they have chosen to share, suggests that the long memory of the country includes more than one human chapter. It includes the present chapter, the one being written by living communities today. It also includes earlier chapters, older inhabitants, vanished neighbors, ancestors who were perhaps not ancestors at all. Lying in the dark tonight, you can almost hear the voices of those stories. They drift in from a great distance, carried on a wind that has been blowing across the country for an unimaginably long time. They speak in languages we no longer know. They speak of people we have forgotten, and they ask us, quietly, whether we are ready to listen. Number 9, the island that time forgot. Tasmania sits off the southeastern coast of the Australian mainland, separated by the broad and stormy waters of Bass Strait. Today it is a state of Australia, a roughly heart-shaped island of forested mountains, cold rivers, and wild coastlines with a population that lives mostly in two small cities. But for most of the period during which humans have been present in this part of the world, Tasmania was not an island. It was the southern tip of the Australian continent, connected to the mainland by a low-lying plain that ran across what is now Bass Strait. People walked into Tasmania across that plain for tens of thousands of years. Then, at the end of the last ice age, as the great glaciers melted and the seas rose, the plain was drowned. The connection was severed. The people who had been living in Tasmania were cut off from the rest of the continent. Perhaps about 12,000 years ago, perhaps a little earlier. For the next 12 millennia, the Palawa, the original inhabitants of Tasmania, lived in complete isolation from the rest of humanity. They developed their own languages, their own ceremonies, their own technologies, in a kind of long, slow experiment in cultural evolution that has few parallels anywhere in the world. What is remarkable about this isolation is what it produced and what it did not produce. The Palawa adapted brilliantly to their cold, rugged island. They developed sophisticated techniques for managing fire, harvesting shellfish, hunting marsupials, and traveling across a difficult terrain. They built bark canoes for short coastal voyages. They created systems of trade and ceremony that linked the different bands of the island together. But certain technologies that were present on the mainland did not survive the long isolation, or perhaps were never invented in Tasmania to begin with. They did not, by the time of European contact, use the boomerang as a hunting weapon, or the spear thrower, or the stitched fur cloak in the form found on the mainland. This pattern raised, for early observers, the haunting suggestion that Tasmania preserved a kind of snapshot of an earlier human population. The Palawa were sometimes described in the racist scientific literature of the 19th century as a relict population of the earliest Australians, isolated by the rising seas and preserved in their original cultural condition. This framing was offensive and wrong on multiple levels, treating the Palawa as living fossils rather than as a living, evolving people with their own history. The reality is that the Palawa adapted to their changing world for 12,000 years on their own, developing what they needed and shedding what they did not. But there is a strange echo within the strange story of Tasmanian isolation. The Palawa themselves preserved certain traditions of an earlier time, of ancestors who had come from the north, of a land that had been lost beneath the sea, of journeys that no living person could remember in detail. They knew in their own way that their country had once been connected to a larger world, and that the world they now lived in was a fragment of an older, larger inheritance. They walked the coastal cliffs and looked out across the grey waters of Bass Strait, and they understood that something was missing on the far side of the horizon. There is a darker chapter to the Tasmanian story that we should acknowledge here. The European colonization of Tasmania in the early 19th century brought a catastrophe upon the Palawa peoples from which no full recovery was possible. Disease, violence, dispossession, and forced removal reduced the population to a small remnant within a few decades. The last fluent speakers of the original Tasmanian languages passed away, and with them went vast bodies of memory that we will never recover. We do not know, and now we cannot know, what they remembered of their deepest past, what stories they carried of the older country, what knowledge they held about the first arrivals on their island, and whatever came before. Tasmania, in this sense, is a place of double mystery. It is mysterious because of what was preserved there, the long, slow experiment of a people isolated for 12,000 years. And it is mysterious because of what was lost there when the colonization broke the chain of transmission and silenced the voices that might have told us what they knew. The wind blows now across the empty quartzite ranges and the cold sedge plains. The seas pound the western beaches. The little fires of the old camps have long since gone out, and the island keeps its secrets, just as it has always done. Number 10. The stones beneath the waves, off the coast of Western Australia, in the warm, clear waters near the town of Albany. There are formations of stones on the sea floor that have caught the attention of divers and researchers for many years. Some of them appear to be natural rock outcrops shaped by the long action of the sea. Others, photographed and surveyed by independent investigators, look like something else entirely. They appear to be deliberately placed stones arranged in linear patterns with right angles and straight edges that seem inconsistent with random geological processes. There are reports of what may be walls, platforms, even small enclosed spaces, lying at depth that suggests they were once on dry land before the seas rose at the end of the last ice age. The mainstream view is that these underwater features are natural. The sea floor in this part of the world is geologically complex, and erosion, sedimentation, and the action of marine organisms can produce shapes that look artificial but are not. Many of the reports of underwater walls and platforms turn out, on closer examination, to be misidentified outcrops of weathered rock, but the question remains worth asking because Australia's coastline today is dramatically different from the coastline that existed during much of the period when humans were present here. At the height of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were more than 400 feet lower than they are today. Vast areas of what are now shallow continental shelf were dry land. The northern coast of Australia extended much further into what is now the Arafura Sea. The eastern coast included a broad plain that has since been drowned. The southern coast joined Tasmania to the mainland across what is now Bass Strait. The total area of dry land available to the early inhabitants of Australia was significantly larger than it is today, perhaps by hundreds of thousands of square miles. This drowned land has a name. Researchers sometimes refer to it as the Lost Coast, or simply as the Great Inundation. It was real country, walked by real people for tens of thousands of years. Whatever camps they made there, whatever fires they lit, whatever ceremonial sites they built, whatever burials they performed, those traces now lie under varying depths of seawater, buried in sediment, scattered by the long action of waves and currents. The oldest evidence of human presence on the Australian continent is almost certainly not on the dry land that we can walk on today. It is offshore, hidden, mostly inaccessible, waiting beneath the sea. If there was an earlier civilization on this continent, an earlier wave of people who came before the ancestors of today's Aboriginal nations, then the evidence for them may be precisely where we cannot easily look. The drowned coastlines are the most plausible places for the earliest large settlements, because human beings have always preferred to live near the sea, where shellfish and fish provided reliable food, where freshwater rivers met the salt, where travel by boat was possible. The drowning of those coastlines at the end of the Ice Age would have erased, or at least concealed, a vast archive of early Australian history. There are tantalizing hints from the underwater world. Side-scan sonar surveys of certain submerged areas have revealed features that look like ancient stream channels, old shorelines, and possibly the outlines of structures. Some of these features in the northern shelves around Australia lie at depths that correspond to known sea levels of 15, 20, or even 30,000 years ago. A few researchers have suggested that systematic exploration of these submerged areas could revolutionize our understanding of early Australian prehistory. Such exploration is technically difficult and expensive, and very little of it has yet been done. So we sit on the modern coastline tonight, listening to the slow rush of the surf, and we imagine the country that lies beneath the dark water just offshore. There are perhaps the foundations of camps out there, the marks of old fires, the bones of people who lived and died on a coast that no longer exists. The sea took it all so slowly that no one living noticed. Generation by generation, the line of the shore crept inland, and the old places became wet country, and then shallow country, and then deep country, and then forgotten country. The waves keep going. The tide rises and falls, and the lost coast keeps its secrets in the dim green light beneath the swell. Number 11. The animals that should not be gone. When the first humans arrived in Australia, whoever they walked into a world full of creatures that no living person has ever seen. The continent was home to an extraordinary range of megafauna, large animals that had evolved in isolation over tens of millions of years. There were marsupial lions, predators the size of leopards, with retractable claws and crushing jaws. There were diprotodons, marsupial giants the size of small rhinos, browsing through the open forests. There were procoptodons, kangaroos the height of a man, with strange short faces and powerful arms. There were thylacines on the mainland, long before they were confined to Tasmania. There were giant flightless birds, called genyornis, taller than an ostrich and capable of dispatching small prey. There were enormous monitor lizards, the megalania, possibly approaching 20 feet in length, the largest land lizards the world has ever seen. Then, in a relatively narrow window of time, most of them disappeared. By around 40,000 years ago, the great Australian megafauna had vanished from the continent. Only the smaller marsupials, the kangaroos and wallabies and possums we know today, survived to the present. The cause of this extinction is one of the great unresolved questions of Australian prehistory. Climate change played a role, habitat shifts played a role, but many researchers believe that human hunting and the changes brought to the landscape by deliberate burning were the decisive factors. The first humans, in this view, walked into a continent full of slow-breeding giants and gradually reduced their populations to the point of collapse. But there is a quieter, stranger thread in the story of the megafauna. In several Aboriginal traditions, there are accounts of creatures that match these extinct animals with surprising precision. The bunyip, in some descriptions, sounds remarkably like a diprotodon, a large furred herbivore that lived in swamps and reed beds. Certain dreaming stories from southwest Australia describe a great striped predator that hunted in the night, which matches descriptions of thylacines or even the marsupial lion. In northern Australia, there are accounts of enormous lizards, far larger than any that exist today, that lived in the swamps and the river country, which match megalania almost exactly. There are even descriptions of huge flightless birds that walked across the plains and could be dangerous to encounter, matching the long extinct genyornis. How is it possible for oral traditions to preserve detailed memories of animals that died out 40,000 years ago? One explanation is that they cannot, and that the stories are based on chance similarities, on encounters with the fossilized bones of these creatures, or on imaginative reconstructions of what those bones must have come from. Another explanation, which some researchers have begun to take seriously, is that the dates of the megafaunal extinction may be more complicated than we currently understand. Perhaps some of these species survived in isolated pockets for much longer than the bulk of the population. Perhaps the thylacine on the mainland persisted into much more recent times than the official record suggests. Perhaps some of the dreaming stories really do preserve direct memory of these animals, carried forward in language and ceremony across the immense gulf of time. Whatever the truth is, the disappearance of the Australian megafauna marks one of the great transformations of this continent. Before that disappearance, the country was a place of giants. After it, the country was a place that had lost most of its largest inhabitants. The forests fell silent, the plains became emptier, the old predators and the old prey faded together, and the country settled into the configuration that the historical Aboriginal nations would inherit and tend for tens of thousands of years. There is a strange question hidden inside this story. If there were earlier humans on the continent, before the ancestors of present Aboriginal peoples, then those earlier humans would also have lived in the company of the megafauna. They would have hunted the diprotodon. They would have feared the marsupial lion. They would have walked carefully through the river country where the megalania waded beneath the lily pads. They would have woven those creatures into their stories, their ceremonies, their understanding of the world. And whatever traces those earlier people left behind would necessarily have included representations of those vanished animals. This is why the rock art of the continent is so important. There are paintings in various parts of Australia that appear to depict animals that no longer exist. Some of these paintings, particularly in the north, show large striped predators that look very much like thylacines. In regions where thylacines have been extinct for thousands of years, some show massive flightless birds. Some show creatures that paleontologists have tentatively identified as belonging to species that died out long before the standard chronology of Aboriginal habitation. Each such painting is a small window into a vanished world. Each one is also a hint that someone was there, watching, painting, remembering, in a time so distant that the very animals on the rock have since faded from the living country. If you stand in front of one of these paintings in the slanting evening light, you can feel the closeness of that older world. The artist's hand was steady. The animal on the wall is recognizable. The lines have not faded. The country is quiet. Somewhere in the distance, you can almost hear the heavy footstep of a creature that the country has not held for many ages, and the soft breathing of a painter who knew that creature by name. This is a good moment to pause for a quiet word. If you have made it this far in tonight's long walk through the deep mysteries of the southern continent, take a moment to leave a single comment below saying simply, "I am still here." Your presence helps the channel grow, and it lets us know who is listening in the dark. Then let your eyes close, let your breathing slow, and let us continue into the deeper country. Number 12. The tools that came too early. The story of human technology in Australia is a story of stone. Wood rots, fibers decay, skins break down into dust within a few generations. But stone survives, and the cutting edges and grinding stones and ground points and microliths that were left behind by the first inhabitants of the continent can be picked up today in many parts of the country, exactly where they were dropped tens of thousands of years ago. The patient work of archaeologists, especially over the last century, has been to read the language of these stones, to understand what kinds of tools were being made, how they were used, how the techniques changed over time, and what those changes tell us about the people who made them. The standard story is reasonably clear in its broad outlines. The earliest inhabitants of Australia, arriving by something like 65,000 years ago, brought with them a stone toolkit that included core tools, simple flakes, and large cutting implements suitable for processing the kinds of plant foods and animals they encountered. Over the millennia, the toolkit evolved, new techniques were developed. The use of ground edges, polished stone axes, hafted tools, and specialized hunting points came in at various points. By the time of European contact, different regions of the continent had developed distinct local technologies, suited to local conditions and local needs. But within this broad story, there are some anomalies that have refused to settle quietly into the official narrative. There are stone tools found in various parts of Australia that appear to be older than the dates that the standard story allows. There are sites where the lowest levels of occupation produce dates that push the human presence back, not to 65,000 years ago, but to 70,000, 80,000, perhaps even further. There are reports, controversial but persistent, of evidence for human activity at 120,000 years, at 150,000, even at much older dates that strain credulity, but cannot easily be explained away. One famous and contested case involves a rock shelter in the Western Desert, where the lowest levels of artifact-bearing deposits were dated by certain methods to ages that significantly exceed any other known site in the country. The dating has been challenged on technical grounds. The artifacts themselves have been re-examined. The debate has gone on for decades. But the bare fact remains that there are sites in Australia where the evidence on its face suggests human presence at far earlier dates than mainstream archaeology can comfortably accept. If even one of these sites holds up to scrutiny, then the timeline of human habitation on this continent will have to be redrawn. There is also the strange question of the so-called proto-axes. In several parts of northern Australia, archaeologists have recovered groundstone axe heads with hafting modifications that appear, on the basis of associated dating, to be older than groundstone technology anywhere else in the world. The development of groundstone tools is usually considered a relatively late achievement in human technological history, associated with the spread of agricultural societies during the last 10,000 years. But the Northern Australian sites suggest that this technology was present in this corner of the world tens of thousands of years earlier. Who developed it? Who taught the technique? Where did the idea come from? We do not know. The standard answer is that the early Australians developed groundstone technology independently in response to local needs, and that the dating of these tools simply reflects an earlier indigenous innovation than was previously recognized. This is a perfectly reasonable answer, and it may well be correct. But it is worth noticing that it is also a slightly uncomfortable answer, because It places one of the great technological innovations in human prehistory in a corner of the world that we have not traditionally thought of as a center of innovation. It forces us to revise not just our chronology, but our entire mental map of where the important developments happened. And then there are the microliths. Microliths are small, finely worked stone tools, typically made by snapping a longer blade into shorter segments and shaping each segment for a specific purpose. The development of microlithic technology in Australia is usually placed at around 5,000 years before the present, possibly in response to climatic changes or new patterns of resource use. But certain assemblages from northern and central Australia include microlithic tools that appear to be much older than that. Some have been argued to be 10,000 years older, or 15, or even more. The pattern of stone tool development across the continent is more complex, more variable, and more interesting than any simple linear story can capture. What all of this hints at, gently and without proving anything definite, is that the technological history of Australia was not a single, smooth, gradual progression. It was a history of waves, of innovations that may have appeared earlier than the official record allows, of techniques that may have spread and faded and reappeared, of regional traditions that may have developed in surprising directions. If there were earlier inhabitants on this continent who arrived and lived and built and made things for many thousands of years before being replaced or absorbed by later waves, then their stone tools would still be here. They would lie quietly in the deeper layers of certain sites. They would turn up occasionally in unexpected contexts. They would form part of the anomalies that the standard story has had to work hard to explain. Whether such tools are actually present is something that only careful, patient, open-minded archaeology can determine. But the possibility is real, and the questions raised by the anomalous dates are not going away. The stones themselves do not lie. They were made by someone. They were used by someone. They were lost or discarded by someone, and they have waded in the soil of this old continent ever since. Patient as only stone can be, for someone to come along and ask them where they came from. Number 13. The petroglyphs of the Burning Country on the Burrup Peninsula on the rugged Pilbara coast of Western Australia lies one of the largest and most extraordinary concentrations of rock art anywhere in the world. The local Aboriginal name for the area is Murujuga, which translates roughly as the hip bone sticking out, a reference to the shape of the peninsula as it juts into the Indian Ocean. The country here is hot, red, and ancient. The hills are made of ironstone and granite that have been weathering under the sun for billions of years. And across these hills, on a scale that defies easy description, are more than 1 million individual rock engravings pecked into the dark patina of the stone. The Murujuga petroglyphs depict an entire universe of subjects. There are human figures, both individual and in groups. There are kangaroos, emus, dingoes, fish, sharks, turtles, snakes. There are abstract patterns, concentric circles, mazes, geometric arrays, whose meanings are still being worked out by researchers and traditional owners alike. There are ceremonial scenes that appear to depict initiation rites, hunting parties, gatherings of beings whose nature we cannot fully understand. And there are images of animals that no longer exist in this part of the world, or perhaps anywhere in the world. There are engravings of what appear to be thylacines, the marsupial wolves that have been extinct on the mainland for thousands of years. There are images of what may be a fat-tailed creature that some researchers have argued represents an extinct macropod. There are even some images that have been tentatively interpreted as depicting megafauna that died out at the end of the Pleistocene. If those interpretations are correct, then some of the Murujuga engravings must be very old indeed. They must be old enough that the artists were familiar with animals that have not existed for tens of thousands of years. Some researchers have argued that certain Murujuga images may be among the oldest figurative art in the world, potentially older than the famous cave paintings of Europe. The dating's difficult because petroglyphs cannot be dated directly in the way that pigment paintings sometimes can. But the indirect evidence based on the weathering of the engravings, the patina formation, and the styles of depiction all point to a body of art that has been built up over an immense span of time. The Aboriginal custodians of Murujuga have always known that the engravings are old. They have stories that describe the engravings as the work of the ancestors, of the creators of the country, of beings who walked here before the present generations were born. Some of the imagery, in their understanding, depicts ceremonies and beings whose meanings are held only by initiated knowledge holders, and which are not for outsiders to know. The country itself is alive with story, and the engravings are a visible expression of that life, carved into the stone in such numbers and over such a long period that no single visit, no single book, no single lifetime of study could exhaust them. There is a darkness in the recent history of Murujuga that should be acknowledged. The Burrup Peninsula has been the site of major industrial development since the 1960s, including gas processing facilities, ports, and heavy industry. In the course of that development, large numbers of engravings have been damaged, destroyed, or moved from their original locations. The acidic emissions from nearby industrial operations are believed to be slowly degrading the patina on which the engravings depend for visibility. Custodial communities, conservationists, and many archaeologists have been advocating for stronger protections for the site, and there have been ongoing efforts to have Murujuga inscribed on the World Heritage List. Whether those efforts will preserve the art for the long centuries it deserves is a question that has not yet been settled. For the purposes of our journey tonight, Murujuga matters because it is one of the great archives of the long human story on this continent. If there were earlier people here who came before the ancestors of the present nations, then their hands may have shaped some of these engravings. The styles, the layered weathering, the subjects, all suggest a body of work that includes multiple traditions, multiple generations, perhaps multiple peoples, layered one over the other in the dark patina of the stone. To stand among the boulders of the Burrup Peninsula in the early morning, with the sea breeze coming in off the Indian Ocean, and to see the figures emerging on every rock face, is to be present at a kind of library whose volumes are made of stone and whose script you cannot read. The custodians read it in their own way. They walk through the country and recognize the engravings as parts of stories they have always known. They listen to the wind in the spinifex and hear the voices of the old people. They watch the seabirds turning over the islands offshore and read patterns in their flight. The engravings are not separate from this living country. They are part of how the country speaks, and among the million voices on these rocks, some of them perhaps speak in dialects so old that even the custodians acknowledge they belong to a time before names. Number 14. The drowned continent. When we look at a modern map of Australia, what we see is a single landmass surrounded by ocean, with New Guinea separated to the north and Tasmania separated to the south. This is the world we live in today. But for most of the period during which humans have lived in this part of the world, the map looked very different. During the cold phases of the Pleistocene, when sea levels were much lower, Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were joined together in a single great continent. Geologists call this combined landmass Sahul. It was about 10% larger than the modern Australia, and it included immense areas of land that are now under shallow seas. Sahul existed on and off for many tens of thousands of years. It was the home of the early humans who walked into this region from Southeast Asia. They could walk from what is now New Guinea down through the Torres Strait region, across the Central Australian plains, down through the Bassian Plain to what is now Tasmania, all on dry land. The continent had its own ecosystems, its own megafauna, its own patterns of rainfall and seasonal climate, its own great river systems flowing across landscapes that have since been completely transformed. Then, beginning around 20,000 years ago and continuing for the next 10,000 years, the great ice sheets of the northern hemisphere began to melt. The sea levels rose, the drowning of Sahul began. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, the lowlands were swallowed. The plains that connected New Guinea to Australia became the Torres Strait. The plains that connected Tasmania to the mainland became Bass Strait. The vast coastal lowlands of the north and east and south disappeared beneath the rising sea. The continent shrank to its modern outline by around 7,000 years before the present. What was lost in this drowning was an extraordinary amount of country. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 15 and 20% of the land area of Sahul was permanently flooded. That is millions of square miles of plains, river valleys, hills, and shores. It is the equivalent of submerging an entire small continent in geological time. And on that submerged country, for tens of thousands of years before the flooding, people had been living, they had been making camps, they had been raising children, they had been burying their dead. They had been carving engravings and painting figures on rock walls that are now buried beneath silt and seaweed. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia in many parts of this continent preserve stories of this drowning. There are traditions from the south coast that describe a time when the land extended much further out to sea, when islands that are now offshore were connected to the mainland, when the sea moved inward slowly and steadily and could not be stopped. These stories have a remarkable feature. They are consistent with what we now know geologically, the details of where the coastline used to be, of which islands were once peninsulas, of which features of the seabed were once dry land, match the geological record of late Pleistocene sea level, rise to a degree that some researchers have found startling. If these stories really do encode memories of the drowning of Sahul, then they may be among the oldest oral traditions in the world. They may carry knowledge that has been transmitted faithfully for 10,000 years or more, surviving the immense gulf of generations between the rising of the sea and the present day. The implications of this are significant. They mean that the long memory of the continent is, in some sense, intact. They mean that the stories of the country are not merely myth in the sense of fable, but contain layers of historical observation that we are only beginning to understand how to read, And they also mean that the deepest stories of Aboriginal Australia, in some cases, predate the drowning. They reach back into the world of Sahul, into a country that no longer exists. They speak of places that are now sea. They preserve, perhaps, the names of features that were once landmarks and that are now drowned ridges or submerged valleys. They are a memory bank of a vanished world, kept alive in the songs and ceremonies of peoples who have never written a single word. What would we find if we could somehow drain the shallow seas around Australia and walk across the floor of Sahul? We would find the remains of countless camps. We would find old hearths scattered with the bones of meals long since eaten. We would find stone tools dropped in the sand by people who never came back to pick them up. We might find the burials of individuals who lived in places that are now 20 fathoms deep. We might find rock art in caves whose openings are now choked with sediment. We might find, if we were lucky, evidence of a civilization or two whose memory has otherwise been completely erased. The great drowning of Sahul did not destroy that earlier world, it only hid it. The submerged country is still there, lying patient under the sea, waiting for someone with the tools and the patience to reach it. Number 15. The mines without miners. In several parts of remote inland Australia, there are sites that are known locally as the old workings or the old mines, or simply as the places where the rocks have been moved. These are areas where stone outcrops show clear signs of having been quarried, where pits have been dug, where loose stone has been heaped to one side, and where the marks of percussion and removal can still be seen on the exposed surfaces. The traditional explanation for these workings is that they were the quarrying sites of the local Aboriginal peoples, who extracted high-quality stone for the making of tools, axes, and ceremonial objects. This explanation is correct for many such sites, and the patterns of working are consistent with the careful, sustained extraction of stone over generations. But there are some sites, especially in the more arid regions of central and western Australia, where the scale and character of the working is more puzzling. There are extensive surface workings that appear to have been concerned with the extraction of metallic ores, particularly copper, silver, and certain iron minerals. These workings are not in places where there are records of historical mining activity. They are remote, in some cases extremely so, and they have been overgrown by vegetation or weathered by long exposure. The pits are partially filled, the tool marks on the exposed faces are old, and there are no obvious tailings, no smelting sites, no remains of camps that would indicate a large mining operation in any recent period. A few independent researchers working over the years have argued that some of these sites may represent ancient mining activity, possibly by visitors from outside Australia, possibly by an earlier inhabitant population whose technological capabilities included the working of metals. The hypothesis is provocative. The standard view is that Aboriginal Australian societies did not develop metallurgy independently and did not engage in mining for metallic ores in the sense that would produce the kinds of extensive surface workings described. If the workings are real and if they really do represent metal extraction, then they would belong either to an unrecognized historical activity or to a much earlier and very different kind of presence on the continent. There are some highly speculative claims attached to these sites. Some researchers have suggested that ancient Mediterranean traders, perhaps Phoenicians, perhaps a related people from the eastern Mediterranean, traveled across the Indian Ocean in search of valuable minerals and reached the Australian coast. There, they would have established mining operations, possibly in cooperation with local peoples, and extracted copper, tin, and other materials for transport back to their home markets. The hypothesis is colorful, attractive to certain kinds of imaginative writers, and has very little supporting evidence beyond the existence of the workings themselves and a few disputed artifacts. A more cautious version of the hypothesis would say only this: the workings exist. Their origin is not entirely clear in every case. Some of them are almost certainly Aboriginal stone quarrying sites that have been misinterpreted by later observers. Others may be the remains of historical European prospecting that has been forgotten by the local record. But it remains possible that a small number of these sites preserve evidence of activities that we do not yet fully understand. Whether these activities were ancient, foreign, or simply unrecorded is a question that further careful research could potentially settle. What we can say with more confidence is that Australia has always been a continent rich in mineral resources. Its iron deposits, copper deposits, gold deposits, and rare mineral deposits are among the largest in the world. The local Aboriginal peoples were aware of many of these resources in their own ways and used certain ochres and stones for ceremonial and practical purposes that involved deep knowledge of the country. The idea that earlier visitors, if any reached the continent, would have been interested in these resources is not implausible. The idea that traces of such interest might remain in the landscape in the form of workings, tools, or scattered artifacts is also not implausible. Whether the available evidence actually supports the idea is another matter. So we walk past the old workings in our imagination in the dry country of the inland, where the sun beats down on red ochre dust and the wind moves through the spinifex. We look at the patient marks on the stone. We see the pits, partially filled with the wind-blown sand of many seasons. We notice that the country itself does not tell us very much. It simply holds what it has been given and waits for us to find out what we can. Somewhere, perhaps under our feet, perhaps in a quiet gully a few miles away, there may be the trace of an older hand at work. Perhaps not. The country is patient with both possibilities, and neither one will be hurried. Number 16. The creatures in the deep water. The bunyip is one of the most distinctive figures in the folklore of Aboriginal Australia. Stories of the bunyip are found across a large portion of the continent, though the details vary considerably from one nation to another. In some traditions, the bunyip is a large furred creature that lives in deep water, in swamps, billabongs, river holes, and reed-choked lagoons. It has a long neck, large eyes, sometimes tusks or fangs, sometimes flippers, sometimes hooves. It is dangerous. It can drag a swimmer down into the dark water and never let them come up again. It is often described as making a deep, mournful sound that can be heard for miles across the still country at night. To call the bunyip is to invite trouble. To go near a known bunyip hole is to risk one's life. For a long time, European observers dismissed the bunyip as a piece of imaginative folklore, perhaps inspired by the seal or the platypus or some other unfamiliar local animal. But in the 1840s and 1850s, when bones of large extinct marsupials began to be found in Australian river deposits, some researchers noticed something: the Diprotodon, a giant marsupial that had lived in Australia until perhaps 40,000 years ago, fit certain descriptions of the bunyip with unsettling closeness. The Diprotodon was a large, furred animal that lived in swampy areas. It was the size of a small rhinoceros or a large hippopotamus. It was probably herbivorous, but its size alone would have made it a creature of awe and caution. If any animal had been a model for the bunyip, the Diprotodon seemed like an obvious candidate. The problem, of course, was that the Diprotodon had been extinct for tens of thousands of years before the recording of the bunyip stories. If the stories really did refer to Diprotodons, then they would have to be preserving memory of an animal that no living person had ever seen for an astonishing length of time. This was considered absurd by the standards of the day, and the comparison was generally dismissed, but the comparison did not go away. Researchers continued to notice that the bunyip stories, in their physical details, were strikingly consistent with the appearance of large extinct Australian marsupials in ways that would be difficult to explain by chance. In the 20th century, paleontologists also began to revisit the bones found in many Australian river systems. Some of them had been recovered from sediments that suggested relatively recent ages, and a small minority of researchers have argued that certain megafaunal species may have survived into the Holocene, perhaps until 10,000 years ago, possibly later in some isolated localities. If even one or two such species had persisted for any length of time after the main extinction event, then the possibility of human memory of them, preserved in oral tradition, becomes much more reasonable. The bunyip is only one example. There are other creatures in Aboriginal tradition that may preserve similar memories. The Yaramaiha, who is a small red creature that drops from trees and drains the blood of its prey, has been compared by some to extinct small predatory marsupials. The wowie is a large lizard-like creature that lived in caves and the bush, sometimes described in ways that match a giant monitor lizard, perhaps the long-extinct Megalania. The big bird stories of northern Australia have been compared to the great flightless Genyornis. There is a pattern here. In nation after nation, language after language, region after region, the traditional creatures of country bear at least passing resemblance to the megafauna that the country once supported. The pattern may be coincidence. It may be the product of imaginative engagement with fossil bones, or it may be something else. Tonight, in the dark, warm air over a quiet billabong somewhere in the inland, you can almost feel the weight of the water. The reeds stir gently. A duck calls in the distance. A fish jumps somewhere out in the middle. And in the deepest part of the pool, perhaps 100 feet down, the silt holds the memory of creatures that once moved through these waters with slow, heavy footsteps. The bunyip is not just folklore, it is the memory of a country that was once larger and stranger and more populated than the country we know. It is the trace of a world that has passed, and in that sense, it is also a clue. It tells us that the long memory of this continent runs much deeper than we usually realize, and that some of what it remembers may be older than any timeline we have yet learned to draw. If the bunyip preserves memory of vanished animals, then it is worth asking what else the long memory may preserve. Memory of vanished peoples, perhaps. Memory of vanished places. Memory of vanished neighbors who lived alongside the ancestors of today's nations for so long that the line between them and the present inhabitants became blurred, and then dissolved, and then disappeared into the deep pool of forgotten time. The bunyip waits in the water, so do other things, and the country, patient as always, keeps them all. Number 17, the hairy people in the forest. There is a creature, or perhaps a person, that has been spoken of in the eastern Australian forests for as long as anyone can remember. It is large, perhaps 7 or 8 feet tall when standing upright. It is covered in dark hair from head to foot. It walks on 2 legs and has a face that some describe as almost human, with a heavy brow and deep-set eyes. It is shy mostly. It avoids people. It lives in the densely forested ranges, the gullies, the rocky escarpments, the places where the bush is so thick that a person can walk past a creature like this from only 10 feet away and never know it was there. It is known by many names. In some districts, it is called the Yowie, in others, the Yarama, in others still, the Doolagal. Each name belongs to a particular country and a particular tradition. The Aboriginal peoples of the eastern forests have spoken of these beings for an immense length of time. They are part of the country. They are part of the law. They are part of the deep history of the dreaming. In some traditions, they are described as the older inhabitants, the ones who lived in the country before the present human peoples arrived. They are not exactly human. They are not exactly animal. They are something in between, or perhaps something older than either category, occupying a place in the world that does not fit neatly into our modern way of thinking about what kind of beings can exist. European observers, of course, dismiss these stories as folklore from the moment they first heard them. But the stories did not disappear. They continued to circulate among bushworkers, timber cutters, stockmen, and travelers throughout the eastern ranges. There are 19th century newspaper accounts of sightings. There are 20th century accounts. There are accounts from last year. The witnesses include sober people, experienced bushmen, scientists, professional trackers, and ordinary people who simply happened to be in the wrong gully at the wrong hour of the evening. The accounts are remarkably consistent. They describe a large, hairy bipedal creature, slightly larger than a man, deeply shy, sometimes curious, sometimes startled, sometimes simply gone before anyone could quite focus on what they were seeing. Now, the modern scientific consensus is firm. There is no yowie. There is no large hominid living in the eastern Australian ranges. The faunal record of the continent does not include any large primate species, ancestral or otherwise, and no fossil evidence of such a species has ever been found. Whatever the witnesses are reporting, they cannot be reporting an actual unknown great ape. The country is too small. The fossil record is too well established. The genetic and ecological evidence is too clear. The Yowie, in the scientific view, is a folkloric being, a piece of imagined country. Perhaps a misidentification of large kangaroos, feral pigs, or other animals in the dim light of dusk, and yet the question lingers. Why is there a Yowie tradition at all? Why does it exist with such consistency across such a wide geographical area in the oral traditions of so many nations? Why do the witness reports describe such a specific kind of creature with such consistent details? Why do the descriptions match so closely the descriptions of hairy hominid beings that appear in the folklore of many other continents, from the Sasquatch of North America to the Yeren of China to the Orang Pendek of Sumatra? There is a global pattern here that has not been satisfactorily explained, and any honest student of folklore has to acknowledge that something interesting is going on, even if we are not yet sure what. There is one thread within the broader question that has particular relevance to our journey tonight. Aboriginal traditions in several parts of Australia describe the Doolagal, or its equivalent, as the people who came before. They are sometimes referred to as the old people, in a sense that suggests cultural priority. They are the original inhabitants of certain country. The present nations are the later arrivals. The old people retreated into the deepest forest as the new people spread out across the country. They became shy, secretive, glimpsed only occasionally. They became, in effect, the memory of an older inhabitation, preserved as a kind of half-wild presence in the dense bush. It is tempting when reading these stories to draw the most extravagant conclusion, to suggest that the Yowie really is the relict of an earlier hominid species, perhaps a descendant of Homo erectus, perhaps something else entirely, that survived in the deep Australian forests long after their counterparts elsewhere had become extinct. The temptation is real. The evidence does not support it. There is no scientific reason to believe that any such species ever existed on this continent, but there is a thread of memory in the country that says quietly and persistently that someone was here before. Someone large and hairy and elusive, someone who never quite went away. So we walk softly through the night forest in our imagination. The eucalyptus trees rise around us, their bark pale and ghostly in the dim light. A wallaby thumps off somewhere to our left. A possum chitters in the canopy. And in the densest part of the gully, where the tree ferns grow thick and the air is heavy with damp, you might pause for a moment, listening, and feel that you are not entirely alone. Perhaps you are imagining it. Perhaps you are simply hearing the wind. Perhaps the country keeps its own counsel, and we cannot always know what is waiting in the dark beneath the trees. Number 18. The traders from the north. For at least 300 years, and possibly far longer, the northern coast of Australia was visited every dry season by fleets of Macassan fishermen who came from the islands of what is now eastern Indonesia. They sailed south on the trade winds in large wooden vessels called praus, equipped with masts, sails, and outrigger-style rigging. They came to fish for trepang, a sea cucumber that was a prized delicacy in the Chinese market, and they spent months each year processing their catch in temporary camps along the North Australian coast. The Macassans interacted extensively with the Aboriginal peoples of the region. They traded with them, hired some of them, intermarried with some of them, and left behind a rich legacy of material culture, language, and tradition that persists to this day. The Macassan trepang trade is one of the few cases of confirmed, well-documented contact between Aboriginal Australia and the outside world before the arrival of the Europeans. The trade left behind tamarind trees planted in many coastal locations that still grow in the area today. It left behind Macassan-style pottery shards, glass beads, iron tools, and remnants of the great processing fires used to smoke the trepang for export. It left behind, in the languages of the local peoples, dozens of loanwords for objects, concepts, and places that originated in the Macassan vocabulary. It left behind, in the rock art of the region, paintings of Macassan praus, with their distinctive curved sails and broad hulls, often depicted in considerable detail. The Macassan trade is dated conservatively to the early 1700s, though some researchers have argued that the actual dates of first contact are significantly older, perhaps reaching back into the 1600s or even earlier. The trade continued until the early 20th century, when Australian colonial authorities effectively shut it down through licensing restrictions and increased policing of the northern waters. By that point, several generations of Aboriginal and Macassan families had built sustained relationships across the Arafura Sea, and the impact of those relationships on Northern Australian culture was very large. But there is a deeper question that the Moccasin trade raises. If sailors from the islands to the north could maintain regular, multi-generational contact with the Australian coast in the 17th and 18th centuries, then how long had such contact actually been going on? The Southeast Asian seas have been crossed by skilled sailors for thousands of years. The trade in valuable marine products has been a feature of the region for a very long time. There is no obvious reason why the Mocassins of the early modern period should have been the first to make these voyages. They may simply have been the latest in a long, slow chain of seafaring contact that stretches back into deep antiquity. There are hints scattered through the archaeological and oral records of northern Australia that earlier contacts may have occurred. Certain styles of fish trap, certain ceremonial objects, certain ritual practices all show resemblances to traditions of the islands to the north that go far beyond what we would expect from the documented Mocassin period alone. There are stories in some Aboriginal traditions of even earlier visitors, of strangers who came in long boats long before the Mocassins, of contacts that are remembered only as fragments. There are also rare archaeological finds of artifacts that appear to be of Southeast Asian origin in northern Australian sites that may be much older than the Mocassin period. If contact between Australia and the outside world has been going on at varying intensities for thousands of years rather than hundreds, then the picture of an isolated continent becomes much harder to maintain. The continent may have been remote, but it was not unreachable. Skilled sailors from the islands to the north could have reached it whenever they had reason to do so. And if they reached it, they would have left traces, and they would have interacted with the local peoples, and they would have potentially modified the cultural and biological landscape in ways that we are only beginning to recognize. This thread of inquiry is not the same as the thread about vanished pre-Aboriginal civilizations, but it is related. It points to the possibility that the long history of human presence on this continent includes more variety, more contact, and more layering than the simple story of isolation suggests. The Mocassins are the easy case, well documented, recent, undeniable. Before them, in the long dim record of the continent's interactions with the wider world, there may be other cases that have not yet been fully recognized. Each one would add to the complexity of the picture. Each one would push back the date at which Australia became part of the larger human story. And so we sit in our imagination on a quiet beach on the north coast as the dry season comes to an end. The trade winds are beginning to shift. The smoke from a distant fire drifts across the water. Out beyond the surf, somewhere in the long blue of the Arafura Sea, the prows would have been making their voyage home, their holds heavy with smoked trepang, and their decks loud with the songs of sailors who had spent months on the Australian coast. And before them, perhaps long before them, other boats may have made similar voyages, carrying other men and women whose names we do not know, whose songs we cannot hear, whose visits to this country are recorded only in the soft memory of trees and stones. Number 19. The patterns in the rock in several parts of Australia, particularly in the southern and southeastern parts of the continent. There are rock engravings that consist of cup-shaped depressions, sometimes surrounded by concentric rings, sometimes connected by linear grooves. These engravings are usually small, no more than a few inches across each cup, but they often appear in large numbers, with dozens or hundreds of cups arranged across the surface of a single rock outcrop. The patterns are usually not figurative. They do not depict animals or human figures. They consist of cups, rings, lines, and combinations thereof, sometimes in ways that suggest deliberate geometric design, and sometimes in ways that suggest a more accumulated ceremonial development over a long period. Cup and ring marks of this kind are found in many parts of the world. They are particularly well known from the British Isles, from Scandinavia, from parts of Spain and Portugal, from various sites in the Americas, and from a scattered set of locations across Asia. They have been the subject of much speculation. Some researchers have argued that they are calendrical, marking solar or lunar alignments. Others have suggested that they are maps of the stars, with each cup representing a particular star, and the linking grooves indicating constellations. Others have proposed that they are ceremonial offering points, where libations were poured or small offerings placed. Others have argued more cautiously that we simply do not know what they were for, but that the wide distribution of similar designs across many parts of the world suggests either a shared cognitive impulse or some pattern of cultural diffusion that has not been fully traced. In Australia, the cup and ring engravings are usually attributed to Aboriginal ceremonial activity, and they form part of the broader rock art traditions of the various nations whose country they are found in. This attribution is almost certainly correct for many such sites, but there are particular cases where the resemblance to engravings found elsewhere in the world is so strong, and the local interpretive tradition is so quiet on the meaning of the markings that some researchers have wondered whether something else is going on, whether some of these engravings might be very old, predating the present interpretive traditions, and connected somehow to traditions that have parallels in distant parts of the world. The standard answer, again, is to invoke independent invention. It is reasonable to suppose that human beings in many parts of the world, working independently with similar tools on similar kinds of stone, might develop similar markings without any direct cultural connection between them. The cup is a simple shape, the ring is a simple shape. The combination of cup and ring is a natural extension of these simple shapes. There is no need to invoke ancient diffusion to explain why people in different places might have come up with the same idea. This is a perfectly respectable position, and it is probably correct in most cases. But there are some cases where the comparison is striking enough to give one pause. There are particular engravings in the southeast of Australia that look remarkably like specific engravings in northern England or southern Scotland. The arrangement of cups, the size and depth of the cups, the manner in which the rings are scored around them, all of these features show parallels that are difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. Some independent researchers have argued that these similarities are evidence of ancient contact, perhaps through seafaring peoples who carried both the technique and the symbolic meaning of cup and ring marking across vast distances. The mainstream view rejects this argument, and probably rightly so. The evidence for direct contact is thin. The similarities on closer inspection often turn out to be less striking than the popular books make them appear. The reasonable position is that the cup and ring tradition in Australia developed within the country, for purposes that are understood by the traditional owners, and that may or may not be shared with outsiders. But the question of the deeper origins of certain designs and motifs in Australian rock art remains open. There are repeated patterns, recurring symbols, certain spirals and concentric arrangements and geometric forms that appear in many parts of the world and that may, in some sense, reflect very deep cognitive structures of the human mind. Or they may reflect contact and exchange across distances that we have not yet fully traced. The truth is probably some combination of both, and the precise mixture is something that careful research will perhaps eventually clarify. For our journey tonight, the cup and ring engravings are a reminder. They are a reminder that the rock art of Australia is a vast and varied archive. It is not a single tradition with a single meaning. It is many traditions layered over each other, sometimes in dialogue, sometimes in tension, sometimes in clear continuity, sometimes in striking discontinuity. The hands that worked these stones came from many generations, many languages, many ways of seeing the world. And among them, perhaps, are hands whose origins we have not yet learned to recognize. Run your fingers in your imagination across the patient stone of an outcrop in some southern part of the continent. The cups are smooth from long ages of weathering. The rings have softened, but they are still visible. The lines that connect them still hold their original direction. Whoever made these marks was thinking carefully. Whoever stood at this outcrop with a stone hammer in their hand was working out a problem or honoring a presence or recording a memory. And the marks they left have outlasted them and their language and their nation, and have survived to be touched by ours tonight in the soft dark of the southern stone. Number 20, the technologies that should have grown. There is a quiet puzzle in the prehistory of Australia that has bothered observant researchers for more than 100 years. It is the puzzle of the missing developments. Across many parts of the world, in the period from about 10,000 years ago to the period of European expansion, human societies underwent a series of dramatic transformations. They developed agriculture, they built cities, they invented writing, they forged metals, they constructed empires, they created elaborate hierarchies of power, intricate systems of trade, and accumulated bodies of formal knowledge. By the standards of these developments, the Aboriginal nations of Australia, at the moment of European contact, looked very different. They had no agriculture in the sense of intensive cropping. They had no permanent cities. They had no writing in the conventional sense. They had no metallurgy. They had no large-scale political units of the kind found in Europe or Asia or the Americas. The reasonable 19th century observer concluded that the Aboriginal peoples were, in some sense, technologically and socially less developed than their counterparts elsewhere in the world. This conclusion was wrong in almost every respect that matters. The Aboriginal nations of Australia had developed extraordinarily sophisticated systems of land management, fire ecology, water harvesting, plant manipulation, fishery management, social organization, law, and ceremony. Their knowledge of the country was deep, detailed, and finely calibrated to local conditions in ways that the European observers could not even begin to appreciate. The absence of certain visible markers of complexity, such as monumental architecture or stored grain, did not mean that complexity was absent. It meant that complexity took different forms, suited to a continent whose climate, soil, water, and biology imposed different constraints than those facing the inhabitants of other parts of the world. But within this larger correction, there is still a strange thread that some researchers have noticed. There are scattered hints throughout the Australian record of practices and technologies that might have been more elaborate at certain earlier periods than they were at the time of European contact. There are signs of what may have been intensive eel farming in southwestern Victoria, involving elaborate stone weirs and channel systems that channeled migrating eels into traps over wide areas. There are signs of what may have been semi-sedentary villages at certain sites, with the foundations of stone houses, the remains of substantial storage facilities, and patterns of organization that suggest much larger and more permanent communities than the mobile bands described by European observers. There are signs of large-scale managed landscapes, with patterns of burning and replanting that essentially constituted a form of agriculture, even if it did not look like the agriculture of the wheat field and the rice paddy. What is striking about some of these signs is that they appear to be older than they are commonly assumed to be. The stone weirs of southwestern Victoria at the famous site of Budge Bim have been dated to a remarkable antiquity, with construction reaching back perhaps 6,000 years or more. The stone houses of certain coastal locations belong to traditions that may stretch much further back than the recent past. The intensive landscape management practiced across much of the continent may have its roots in practices that began many tens of thousands of years ago, in the early period of human inhabitation. The puzzle, in its most provocative form, is this. If the early inhabitants of Australia were already developing such sophisticated land management and resource intensification practices many thousands of years ago, why did these practices not continue to develop in the directions that we associate with elsewhere in the world? Why did the elaborate fish trap systems not become full-scale aquaculture? Why did the stonehouse clusters not become walled towns? Why did the careful management of plant communities not become full-scale agriculture? The standard answer is that the conditions of the continent did not favor such developments, that the populations were small enough and the resources abundant enough, that the pressures driving intensification elsewhere were not as acute in Australia. This is a reasonable answer. It is probably partially true. But there is another possibility that has been less explored. It is the possibility that intensification did occur in certain places and at certain times, but did not survive into the historical record. It is the possibility that certain practices were lost, certain technologies forgotten, certain elaborations of social organization disrupted by events that we do not now know about. It is the possibility, in other words, that the long story of Australian prehistory included episodes of growth and complexity that were later interrupted, perhaps by climate change, perhaps by disease, perhaps by the collapse of trade networks, perhaps by the disappearance of one population and its partial or complete replacement by another. If there were earlier peoples on this continent, peoples whose presence preceded the ancestors of today's nations, then their disappearance would have constituted exactly such an interruption. Whatever they had built up, whatever they had developed, whatever they had begun to elaborate over many generations, would have been disrupted when their society collapsed or was displaced. The later inhabitants would have inherited a country in which the previous chapter had already ended, and they would have built their own civilization on the same ground, but starting from a different beginning. The result might look, to an outside observer, like a society that had never fully developed the technologies and complexities that we expect to see in long inhabited regions. But the appearance would be misleading. The earlier development would lie buried under the more recent layers, accessible only through careful archaeology that has not yet been fully attempted. There is no decisive evidence for this scenario. It is a speculation, an attempt to imagine how the apparent puzzle of certain Australian developments could be reframed. But the speculation is not idle. It is the kind of thinking that should be entertained when looking at any deep human history. The history of every continent is more complex than the simple linear story we often tell about it. There are gaps, there are interruptions, there are episodes that have been forgotten and rediscovered. There are layers beneath layers, each one waiting for its own careful reading. The history of Australia is no different in this respect, and the assumption that the historical Aboriginal nations represent a kind of continuous, unchanging cultural baseline for the whole of human presence on the continent is a simplification that does not hold up well under close examination. Walking in our imagination across a stonefish trap that has not been actively maintained for centuries, with the fresh water rushing through its narrow channels, you can feel the breath of an older world. The patient labor of generations went into shaping these stones, the knowledge of where to place them, of how to direct the flow of water, of how to harvest the fish that came through, of how to share the catch with neighboring families, was passed down across an immense span of time. It is still being passed down. The custodians of these places know more than they have ever told outsiders, and the country is still teaching what it has always taught in the slow language of stone and water and changing seasons. And underneath the present knowledge, perhaps, are older layers, deeper instructions, fainter voices from a country that is even older than the very ancient country we can see. Number 21. The arrival from the sea. In many parts of Aboriginal Australia, the dreaming stories of how the present nations came to inhabit their country include an arrival. The ancestors came from somewhere. They emerged from the earth. They came down from the sky. They walked across a land bridge from the north. They paddled in long canoes from across the sea. The details vary from one tradition to another, and the relationships between these arrivals and the deeper creation stories of country are themselves the subject of careful ceremonial knowledge that is not always shared with outsiders. But the theme of arrival is widespread, and it sits alongside the equally widespread theme of having always been here, in a way that the European mind often struggles to hold in the same thought. What is striking about some of these arrival stories is the specificity of certain details. There are traditions, particularly in Northern Australia, that describe the first ancestors as having come from across a body of water that they had to cross in boats. There are traditions that describe particular landing places, particular routes of inland movement, particular meetings with the spirit beings of the country who had to be negotiated with before the new arrivals could settle. There are traditions that name the previous occupants of certain countries, sometimes describing them as spirits, sometimes describing them as earlier people, sometimes describing them in language that suggests the storyteller is trying to communicate a complex historical relationship in the available vocabulary. In some traditions, the arrival of the present ancestors is associated with a struggle. The new arrivals had to make peace with the previous inhabitants. They had to learn the country from beings who already knew it. They had to take up the responsibilities that the older people had been carrying. In some accounts, the older people moved aside. In some accounts, the older people were defeated. In some accounts, the older people simply faded away, becoming the spirits of the country, present but no longer visible, watching the new generations from a quiet remove. These stories are not history in the strict sense. They are not chronicles. They are not historical archives in the manner of written records elsewhere, but they are something. They are condensed memory. They are the way that the long inhabitation of countries held in language. And they consistently include the idea that the present generations are not the first generations. There were people before, there were beings before. There were inhabitants of country whose departure or transformation preceded the arrival of the present custodians. How are we to read these stories? One reading is that they are entirely mythological, referring to spirit beings and creator ancestors who exist outside the ordinary historical timeline. This reading is consistent with much of the religious meaning that these stories carry, and it should not be set aside. Another reading is that they are partially historical, encoding memories of actual events in the language of myth, including memories of population movements, of contact with earlier inhabitants, of the long, slow process by which the country came to be occupied by the people who occupy it today. A third reading combines these approaches, holding that the stories are simultaneously myth and history, that the language of spirit beings and creator ancestors is the language in which historical memory was traditionally preserved, and that to separate the two elements is to misunderstand both. If even a partial historical reading is correct, then the arrival stories of Aboriginal Australia may be among the oldest historical accounts in the world. They may preserve, in the particular forms of particular traditions, memories of events that took place many tens of thousands of years ago. They may include memories of the journey across the seas from Southeast Asia, of the first landings on the northern coast, of the slow movement inland across a continent that was different from the one we know today. They may include, in some traditions, memories of meeting earlier inhabitants, of the kinds of relationships that were established with them, of how the present nations came to take responsibility for country that may have had earlier custodians. The implications of this are large. They mean that the deepest stories of the country are not abstract poetry. They are accounts of how the country came to be inhabited by the people who inhabit it now. They include relationships with earlier people, in some cases, that have been preserved through ceremony, song, and law for periods of time that we can only estimate. They are the long memory of a population that has never been more than partially in contact with the wider world, but that has carried its own record forward with a fidelity that puts most written archives to shame. So tonight, as you lie in the dark, you can imagine a small group of people standing on a North Australian beach in the soft light of a long ago morning. They have come a long way. The sea behind them is wide and deceptive. The land ahead of them is unknown. The boats they came in are pulled up on the sand, their planks worn smooth by many crossings. The wind is in their faces. The cry of an unfamiliar bird carries from somewhere inland. And they look up, perhaps, at a tall figure standing among the trees, watching them. Someone is already here. Someone has been here for a long time. And the new arrivals must find a way to enter the country, to learn its laws, to take up its responsibilities, in conversation with whoever was here first. That conversation, in some sense, has been going on ever since. Number 22. The places that must not be approached. In every Aboriginal nation across Australia, there are places that are not for everyone. They are places of particular ceremonial importance, places where certain laws are kept, places where only initiated knowledge holders are permitted to go, and where outsiders are politely but firmly excluded. Some of these places are wells, soaks, water holes that are tied to particular dreaming stories. Some are caves or rock shelters, some are sections of river, of cliff, of coastal headland. Some are quite small, some cover large areas of country. The reasons for the restrictions are various, but they all relate to the careful management of dangerous, powerful, or simply private knowledge that has been kept in the country since the beginning of memory. What is interesting for our journey tonight is that some of these places are described in particular traditions as belonging not to the present custodians but to the old people. They are spoken of as the country of those who came before. They are described as places where the old laws still operate, where the older spirits still walk, where the present inhabitants are guests in a country that is fundamentally not theirs to manage. To approach such a place without authorization is dangerous in ways that go beyond the dangers of trespass. It is to step into a country that may not recognize you, that may not welcome you, that may quietly remove you from your senses or your life if you fail to show the proper respect. There is no way for an outsider to verify these accounts. The custodians of such places are, by definition, not in the business of explaining them to outsiders. The knowledge of why a particular site is restricted, of what stories are kept there, of what beings are understood to be present, is part of the private inheritance of the relevant nation and is not shared lightly. But the fact of the restriction is itself a public statement. It tells us that the country, as the Aboriginal nations understand it, is not a uniform field that can be walked freely from end to end. It is a layered, complex, and sometimes dangerous landscape, with places of greater and lesser power, with histories that go back into deep time, and with relationships of authority and responsibility that have to be navigated carefully. When such restricted places are described as belonging to the old people, the implication is striking. It suggests that the present custodians understand themselves to be living in a country whose deeper layers were laid down by earlier inhabitants. It suggests that those earlier inhabitants are still present in some sense in the country today, that they have not entirely departed, that they continue to exert a kind of authority over certain places. It suggests, finally, that the long inhabitation of this continent included more chapters than the simple story of a single human population spreading out and adapting to local conditions. There were earlier custodians, there were transitions, there were arrangements that had to be made between the older people and the newer arrivals. Arrangements that are still being honored in the form of restricted sites and quiet, careful avoidances. There are particular sites in various parts of Australia where the strangeness of the country is felt by even the most skeptical visitor. There are caves where the air is heavy and still in a way that is hard to describe. There are gullies where the bush seems to listen. There are rocky outcrops where the temperature changes in subtle and unpredictable ways. There are stretches of beach where the light falls at angles that the eye cannot quite resolve. These are not necessarily restricted sites in the formal sense that the local custodians would recognize, but they are places where the country itself seems to be thicker, denser, more present. Many travelers have noticed this without being able to explain it. The land has a quality that does not yield easily to outside understanding. If there is anything to the long thread we have been following tonight, then some of these places may be precisely the places that the older inhabitants paid particular attention to. They may be the locations of vanished camps, of forgotten ceremonies, of significant events that have left their trace in the country in ways that are detectable even to those who do not know what they are detecting. The country, in this sense, holds its own archive. It does not surrender its secrets to the casual visitor. It speaks only in the slow language of place, atmosphere, and presence. But it is speaking all the time. And what it is saying includes the names and the memories of those who came before, even when those names and memories are no longer carried by any living language. So tonight, in your imagination, walk softly past a place that asks not to be entered. Do not look too closely. Do not ask too many questions. Simply pass by with the kind of quiet respect that travelers use to show in such places, and let the country continue its own conversation with whoever is listening. There are presences here that have been here for a long time. They do not need our attention. They do not require our names. They have their own. They have always had their own, and they will continue to have their own long after we have closed our eyes for the last time and let the dark of the country settle gently over us. Number 23. Where did they go? If there really was an earlier civilization in Australia before the ancestors of the present Aboriginal nations arrived, then we are left with one of the most important and most difficult questions in the whole of human history. What happened to them? Where did they go? How does a people simply vanish from a continent, leaving behind only scattered traces, only ambiguous bones, only stories that survive in the memory of those who came after? The question is not unique to Australia. The history of every continent includes peoples who have disappeared, who have been absorbed into larger populations, who have been driven to extinction by climate or disease or competition. But the Australian case, if it is real, would be on a particularly large and quiet scale. There are several scenarios that would be consistent with the limited evidence we have. The first is that the earlier inhabitants, if they existed, were simply absorbed. They interbred with the later arrivals, and over the generations, their distinct genetic and cultural identity merged into the larger population that became the ancestors of the present Aboriginal nations. In this scenario, the earlier people did not really vanish. They are still here in the genes of the country's modern inhabitants, in the dreaming stories that have been preserved across the generations, in the ceremonies that may have originated with them and were then carried forward by their descendants. The mainstream genetic evidence is largely consistent with this kind of scenario, even if it does not strictly require it. The second scenario is that the earlier inhabitants were displaced. They were pushed into less hospitable parts of the continent, where they continued to exist as smaller, more marginal groups for some time, before eventually being absorbed or dying out. Their descendants might survive in attenuated form in some of the more isolated populations of the continent. The genetic signal of their presence might be faint but still detectable in particular communities, in particular regions. There are some interesting genetic studies that have hinted at unusual signals in certain Aboriginal populations. Signals that might be interpreted as the trace of an earlier and distinct human group, though the interpretation of these signals is contested and remains an active area of research. The third scenario is that the earlier inhabitants disappeared more abruptly through some combination of climate change, disease, ecological disruption, or violent conflict. The end of the last ice age brought dramatic environmental changes to Australia, with the drowning of vast areas of coastal land, the disappearance of many megafaunal species, and the reorganization of ecosystems across the continent. Such changes could have devastated a human population that was tightly adapted to the conditions of the late Pleistocene, particularly if that population was relatively small and limited to certain coastal regions. The arrival of later waves of human migration could have been the final blow to a society already weakened by environmental upheaval. The fourth scenario, which combines elements of the others, is that there was no single endpoint at all. The earlier inhabitants did not vanish in one event, in one century, in one millennium. They faded slowly over thousands of years through a combination of absorption, displacement, and decline. By the time the latest waves of migration arrived, the earlier population had already become small, scattered, and culturally diminished. The newer arrivals encountered remnants rather than a complete society, and the remnants were either absorbed or quietly disappeared into the deeper landscape. This kind of slow fade is consistent with the patterns of cultural change that we see in many parts of the world, where one population gives way to another over many generations, with the boundary between them more like a slow blurring than a sharp transition. There is a fifth possibility that is rarely discussed but worth considering. It is the possibility that the earlier inhabitants did not all vanish at once, or even mostly. Some of them may have retreated into the most remote and difficult parts of the continent, holding on in small numbers in places that the newer arrivals had little interest in occupying. The deep deserts of the interior, the high country of certain ranges, the dense rainforests of the tropical north, the cold, rugged southwest of Tasmania. In these regions, small populations of the earlier inhabitants could potentially have persisted for thousands of years, gradually dwindling as the climate shifted and the country changed around them, eventually disappearing through the combined pressures of small population size, environmental stress, and limited contact with the wider continental population. By the time European observers arrived, these last remnants would have been long gone, leaving only the faintest traces in oral tradition, in unusual local genetics, in particular ceremonial practices that might preserve memories of the older people. This scenario has the advantage of explaining why some of the most persistent stories of older inhabitants come from precisely the kinds of remote, isolated, or difficult regions where such remnant populations might be expected to have survived longest. The hairy people of the dense eastern forests, the old people of certain restricted desert sites, the earlier inhabitants of particular ranges and gullies that are described in dreaming stories as being too dangerous, too sacred, or too strange for casual visitation. These stories might be the last echoes of populations that survived in small numbers for far longer than the standard chronology allows, in places where their presence would have been most difficult to detect and most easy to forget. If something like this happened, then the disappearance of the earlier inhabitants was not a single event. It was a long, slow fade across many regions and many millennia, with the last small communities perhaps persisting into times much closer to our own than we usually imagine. The country may have held them for a very long time before finally letting them go. And the country may still hold the traces of their last camps, their last fires, their last burials in some of the most remote and least visited parts of the continent, waiting for archaeologists who have not yet set foot in those places to find what may be the most important and least expected evidence of all. The honest answer is that we do not know which scenario is closest to the truth or whether any of them is right at all. The evidence is too thin, the dating is too uncertain, the genetic signals are too contested, The archaeological record is too incomplete. What we have is a series of hints, a series of anomalies, a series of stories, a series of places that ask not to be entered, animals that should not be remembered, paintings that should not be there, tools that came too early, bones that broke the timeline, and a long quiet sense on this oldest of continents that the visible inhabitation of the present is layered over an older inhabitation that we have not fully recognized. If we want to think about the question seriously, we have to hold all of these possibilities open. We have to be willing to consider that the standard narrative of a single continuous Aboriginal presence stretching back 65,000 years may be substantially correct, and that the various anomalies are mostly explainable within that framework. We have to be willing to consider that there were earlier inhabitants who were absorbed, displaced, or who faded away. We have to be willing to consider that the genetic and cultural relationships between past and present populations may be more complex than any simple model has captured. What we should not do in any case is pretend that the question is closed. The history of human inhabitation on this continent is one of the deepest and most fascinating questions in the human past. It deserves to be approached with respect, with curiosity, with patience, and with a willingness to be wrong about our most cherished assumptions. The country itself holds the answers. The custodians of country hold a large part of the relevant memory. The archaeological record holds another part. The genetic record holds another. The drowned coastlines and the buried sites and the unexcavated caves and the unrecorded oral traditions hold pieces that we have not yet seen. The picture is incomplete, and it will remain incomplete for a long time, perhaps forever. But the question is worth asking. The journey is worth taking. The long, quiet walk through the deep past of this continent with its painted figures and its drowned shores and its hairy people in the forest and its bunyips in the dark water and its stories of arrival and its places that must not be approached is a journey into one of the great mysteries of our species. We may not be able to solve it. We can at least sit with it in the gentle dark and let it speak to us in its own slow voice. And perhaps in the silence after the speech, we can catch a faint echo of those who came before and lift our hands in greeting across the immense quiet of the country and let them know that we have heard them, even if we do not yet know their names. Number 24. The languages that left no speakers. When the first European observers began to record the languages of Aboriginal Australia in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they encountered one of the most linguistically diverse parts of the world. At the time of European contact, there were probably more than 250 distinct Aboriginal languages spoken across the continent, organized into a smaller number of language families and isolates. The largest family, Pama-Nyungan, covered roughly 4/5 of the continent, with 170 or so daughter languages stretching from the deserts of the west to the tropical north and the temperate southeast. The remaining 1/5 of the continent, mostly in the far north, was occupied by what linguists call the non-Pama-Nyungan languages, which include some of the most internally diverse and grammatically complex languages in the world. The pattern of linguistic distribution in Australia poses a quiet but persistent puzzle. The Pama-Nyungan family, despite covering such a vast area, is relatively young in linguistic terms. Most estimates place its common ancestor at perhaps 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. which means that all of the languages of that family have descended from a single source within that relatively recent time frame. This is striking because human beings have been present in Australia for at least 65,000 years. If the Parmanyungan family is only 7,000 years old, then what was spoken on most of the continent before that? What replaced the older languages, and what happened to their speakers? The standard answer is that the Parmanyungan family spread across the continent in a relatively recent expansion, perhaps driven by climatic improvements, perhaps by social or technological developments that gave its speakers some kind of competitive advantage. The languages that the Pama-Nyungan speakers replaced are now mostly gone, surviving only in fragmentary traces in the non-Pama-Nyungan languages of the north, which preserve some of the older linguistic diversity. The expansion was peaceful in this account, achieved through gradual demographic shift rather than through conquest, and the speakers of the earlier languages were absorbed into the expanding Pama-Nyungan world over many generations. This is a reasonable scenario. It is consistent with the available evidence. But it does raise some interesting follow-up questions. What did the older languages sound like? What grammatical structures did they have? What words did they preserve for places, animals, ceremonies, beings? How much of the older linguistic world survives faintly as substrate in the daughter languages of Pama-Nyungan, or in the place names of country, or in particular ritual vocabularies that may have been borrowed rather than inherited? These are difficult questions to answer because the older languages are mostly gone. But there are tantalizing hints. There are place names in various parts of Australia that do not fit easily into any known language family. There are ritual words and ceremonial vocabularies that appear to have been inherited from sources that no longer exist as living languages. There are striking grammatical features in certain Aboriginal languages that are difficult to explain by descent from any reconstructed ancestor, and that may represent the survival of structures from older, now extinct languages. The non-Pama-Nyungan languages of Northern Australia are particularly interesting in this regard. They include languages with extraordinary grammatical complexity, with classifier systems, polysynthetic verb structures, and noun classes that suggest deep histories of independent development. Some of these languages may be the surviving representatives of much older linguistic traditions that once covered larger areas of the continent before the Pama-Nyungan expansion swept across the south. Studying them carefully may give us our best glimpse into the linguistic landscape that existed before the recent reorganization. If there were earlier inhabitants on this continent, peoples who arrived before the ancestors of the present Aboriginal nations, then they would have spoken languages. They would have had words for everything they knew, for every animal, plant, place, and being in their country. They would have had grammatical structures, sound systems, ways of building sentences and stories. They would have passed these languages down from generation to generation for perhaps tens of thousands of years. And when their population declined, was absorbed, or was replaced, their languages would have begun the slow process of disappearance. Some words might have been borrowed by the newcomers, some grammatical features might have been picked up, some place names might have been preserved, but the bulk of the linguistic record would have been lost. This is exactly the kind of disappearance that linguists study in other parts of the world. The substrate effect, as it is called, refers to the influence of an earlier and now extinct language on a later language that has taken its place. The substrate may be detectable in subtle ways, in unusual sound patterns, in unexpected vocabulary, in grammatical features that do not fit the larger family. The substrate is usually difficult to study because the original language is gone, and we have to infer its existence from the traces it has left. In Australian linguistics, there is a small but interesting body of work on possible substrate effects in the various languages of the continent. Some researchers have argued that certain Aboriginal languages show signs of having absorbed structures from older, now extinct languages. Others have pointed to particular vocabulary items that do not fit any reconstructed family, and that may be borrowings from earlier linguistic strata. The evidence is suggestive rather than decisive, and the field is full of disagreement, but the general possibility is taken seriously by working linguists. What would the languages of the earlier inhabitants have sounded like? We do not know. We have no recordings. We have no written records. We have only the faint traces in the languages that came after, and the place names that survive in country, and the ritual vocabularies that may have been borrowed from sources that no longer exist. The earlier languages are, in this sense, completely gone. They are the deepest of the silences that hang over the long story of this continent. They are the words that were carried in the mouths of people whose names we do not know, who spoke to each other in the shade of trees that are no longer standing, who told stories to their children in languages that will never be heard again. There is something profoundly haunting about the loss of a language. A language is more than a system of communication. It is a way of seeing the world. It is a structure of thought, a pattern of attention, a particular relationship between speakers and the country they inhabit. When a language dies, that whole world dies with it. The particular jokes are forgotten. The particular endearments are silenced. The particular descriptions of place, of weather, of feeling, of being are all extinguished. The country itself loses a way of being named, of being held in mind, of being kept in the careful, patient way that languages keep their countries. If earlier inhabitants once spoke earlier languages in this country, then those languages have died. The world they encoded has died. The way of seeing the continent that they preserved is no longer accessible to anyone. We can only stand at the edge of that great silence, listening for the faint echoes, watching for the substrate effects, picking up the few place names and the few ritual words that may carry traces of the older vocabularies. The country itself remembers them, in some sense. The shape of the land was named by them, long before the present names were laid down. The trees grew up while they were speaking. The rivers ran past their camps. The stars wheeled overhead while their songs floated up into the night. So listen tonight to the wind moving through the country. Listen to the sound of water over a stone. Listen to the cry of a curlew in the dark. Somewhere in those sounds, somewhere in the way they fit the country, there may be the faint resonance of words that were once said in this place by people whose language has now joined the great quiet of the unrecorded past. Number 25. The fires that came too soon. There is a particular signature in the geological record of Australia that has fascinated and puzzled researchers for decades. It is the signature of fire. Beginning at a certain point in the prehistory of the continent, the rate of fire in the Australian landscape appears to have changed. The frequency of burning increased. The character of the vegetation began to shift in response. Species that depended on infrequent fire began to decline. Species that thrived under regular burning began to expand. The whole continent, in effect, began to be reshaped by a pattern of human directed fire that has continued ever since, and that the historical Aboriginal nations refined into one of the most sophisticated landscape management techniques in human history. The use of fire as a tool of land management is sometimes called fire stick farming, a phrase coined in the 1960s to describe the way that Aboriginal peoples have used fire to manage country. The practice involves the deliberate burning of patches of vegetation at specific times of year, in specific weather conditions, for specific purposes. It encourages the growth of certain food plants. It maintains open grasslands suitable for hunting. It clears out the dense undergrowth that would otherwise build up and feed catastrophic wildfires. It opens up routes for travel and trade. It maintains the country in a condition that supports the kinds of foods and the kinds of animals that human beings need. The development of fire stick farming on the Australian continent is one of the great achievements of human ecological knowledge. It required the accumulation over many generations of detailed knowledge about the behavior of fire, the responses of different plant species, the timing of seasonal weather, the movements of animals, and the complex feedback effects of burning patterns on the long-term health of the country. The historical Aboriginal nations carried this knowledge in elaborate ceremonial and practical systems that have been studied with increasing respect by researchers in recent decades, as the value of such knowledge for modern landscape management has become more widely recognized. The puzzle that arises in the context of our journey tonight is the question of when this remarkable practice first began. The geological evidence of increased fire frequency in Australia goes back a long way. Some studies have placed the beginning of the human fire signature at around 50,000 years ago, roughly coinciding with the earliest established dates for human arrival on the continent. Other studies have suggested that the signature may begin somewhat earlier, perhaps before the conventionally accepted arrival date, raising the possibility that humans were present in Australia for longer than the standard chronology allows. There is also a question of the development of the practice. Fire stick farming is a sophisticated set of techniques. It is not the kind of thing that newly arrived hunter-gatherers, encountering an unfamiliar continent for the first time, would immediately be able to perform with expertise. It requires deep familiarity with local conditions, with local species, with local seasons. It requires the kind of accumulated ecological knowledge that takes many generations to develop. The early inhabitants of Australia would have had to learn the country before they could begin to manage it through fire. They would have had to make mistakes, to observe consequences, to refine their techniques, to develop the elaborate seasonal and ceremonial knowledge that the historical fire stick farming represented. How long did this learning process take? We do not know. It could have been a few thousand years. It could have been much longer. But the fact that the geological signature of human-directed fire is detectable so early in the Australian record suggests that the basic practice of using fire to shape the landscape was being developed within the first few thousand years of human presence on the continent. The full sophistication of the practice may have come later, but the basic relationship between human beings and fire was being worked out from the beginning. If there were earlier inhabitants on this continent before the ancestors of the present Aboriginal nations, then they too would have been using fire. They would have been part of the long process of working out how to manage the country through burning. They would have made discoveries, developed techniques, encoded their knowledge in stories and ceremonies. Some of their knowledge may have been inherited by the later inhabitants, becoming part of the foundation on which the historical Aboriginal nations built their own elaborate systems. Some of it may have been lost, some of it may have been transformed beyond recognition. There is a fascinating thread here that touches on the question of cultural continuity and discontinuity. If the use of fire to manage the Australian landscape was an inheritance from earlier inhabitants, then the historical Aboriginal nations were not the first developers of the practice, but its continuators, the carriers forward of a tradition that began before their ancestors arrived. This would not diminish their achievement. The refinement, elaboration, and continuation of an inherited practice over tens of thousands of years is itself an achievement of extraordinary magnitude. But it would change the picture slightly. It would mean that the fire stick farming tradition is even older than we usually assume, and that its roots reach back into a period of human presence on the continent that we have not yet fully recognized. There is even more provocative variant of this thought. It is the possibility that the increase in fire frequency in early Australia was the work of a pre-Aboriginal population whose techniques were inherited but whose identity has been forgotten. In this picture, the first people who arrived in Australia would have begun burning the country in their own way, transforming it over thousands of years into a fire-managed landscape. By the time later waves of migration arrived, the country had already been substantially shaped by the earlier inhabitants. The newcomers inherited a continent that had been worked by human hands for so long that the original wilderness no longer existed. They added their own contributions to the fire management tradition, refined it, elaborated it, but they did so in a country whose basic character had already been set by those who came before. This scenario is speculative. The available evidence does not require it. The simpler explanation that the development of fire stick farming was the work of the ancestors of the present Aboriginal nations from their very arrival is consistent with everything we know, but the alternative scenario is not impossible, and it is worth holding in mind as we think about the long human history of this continent. The fires that shape the Australian bush are very old fires. They have been lit season after season by human hands for tens of thousands of years. The grass that grows back after a burn carries the genetic memory of countless previous fires. The trees that survive in particular shapes have been pruned by fire over so many generations that they no longer remember any other condition. The country itself has been adapted to human use through the patient labor of fire in a partnership between human beings and the land that may be one of the oldest such partnerships anywhere in the world. And so we sit by a small fire in our imagination tonight in a quiet patch of country somewhere in the deep continent. The flames flicker, the smoke rises, the dry grass crackles around the edge of the fire ring, and we know, even in this small fire, that we are part of a long line of fire makers on this country, stretching back through every generation that has inhabited this place. The early people made fires. The earlier people, if they were here, made fires too. The fires are an unbroken thread, connecting us across the immense quiet of time to all the others who have ever sat by such a fire on this old continent and looked out into the dark. And so we come to the quiet end of our long walk through the deep mysteries of the southern continent. We have spent the night together moving through painted galleries in the Kimberley, through rumoured pyramids in the Queensland rainforest, through carved sandstone gullies north of Sydney, through the empty desert of South Australia, through old maps drawn in candlelit chambers in faraway Europe. Through the dust of Lake Mungo, through the watching faces of the Wangina, through the gentle voices of dreaming stories about earlier people, through the windswept ranges of Tasmania, through the drowned coastlines that lie beneath the modern seas, through the patient bones of vanished megafauna, through the stone tools that came too early, through the engraved boulders of Murujuga, through the great sunken country of Sahul, through the old quarries of the inland, through the deep pools where the bunyip waits, through the dense gullies where the doolagal might still be listening, through the prows of the Macassan trade, through the cup and ring stones of the south, through the technologies that grew and then fell quiet, through the arrival stories of new ancestors meeting older ones, through the places that must not be approached, through the question of where the older people went, through the silent languages that no one speaks anymore, through the long, unbroken thread of fire. None of what we have looked at tonight proves definitively that there was an earlier civilization in Australia before the ancestors of the present Aboriginal nations arrived. The standard story, the careful mainstream account that places a single continuous Aboriginal presence on this continent for at least 65,000 years, is built on a vast amount of evidence and represents the best understanding of professional archaeologists and geneticists working with the data available to them. We should respect that account. We should not casually overturn it on the strength of anomalies and stories alone. The custodians of the country, whose own ancestral relationships with this continent run staggeringly deep, deserve to have their inheritance recognized and honored without being treated as latecomers on land they have walked for tens of thousands of years. But we should also not pretend that the question is closed. The history of Australian prehistory is full of unsolved puzzles, contested dates, anomalous finds, and stories that have not been fully reconciled with the official narrative. The drowning of Sahul has hidden a vast quantity of evidence that we cannot easily reach. The dating of the deepest archaeological layers continues to produce surprises that push the timeline of human presence further back than we expected. The genetic record contains signals that researchers are still working to interpret. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australia, when listened to carefully and respectfully, suggest a long memory that includes more chapters than the simple story of a single continuous inhabitation. And the country itself, with its painted galleries and its restricted sites, and its strange engravings and its persistent traditions of older people who came before, seems to be telling us something that we have not yet learned how to fully hear. The question for tonight is not whether the standard story is wrong. It may be entirely right. The question is whether we are willing to entertain the possibility that it is more complicated than we currently understand. Whether we are willing to consider that there are layers in the long story of this continent that we have not yet excavated. Whether we are willing to hold the question open with patience and humility while the slow work of archaeology and genetics and careful listening to the traditional knowledge holders of country continues to clarify what really happened here in the deep past. If there were earlier inhabitants, what kind of people were they? Were they technologically and ceremonially similar to the later inhabitants, or were they different in important ways? Did they speak related languages, or completely different ones? Did they look like the ancestors of today's nations, or did they look different in subtle physical ways? Did they have stories of their own arrival, of an even earlier population that preceded them? in an endless recession of older and older inhabitants, stretching back beyond what any oral tradition could carry. Were they absorbed, displaced, or driven to extinction? Did they leave any descendants, or did their genetic and cultural inheritance simply vanish into the larger river of human history? These are not questions that can be answered tonight, or in any single conversation. They are questions that will take decades, perhaps centuries of careful research to clarify. They will require the patient cooperation of archaeologists, geneticists, linguists, and most importantly, the traditional custodians of country who hold the deepest memory of the continent. They will require new techniques for exploring the drowned coastlines that hold so much of the relevant evidence. They will require humility about what the standard models can and cannot tell us. They will require a willingness to be surprised, to be wrong, to revise our most cherished assumptions about who has been here and for how long. Now we turn the question over to you. After everything we have walked through together tonight, what do you think is the most likely explanation? Do you think the anomalies and the stories really do point to an earlier civilization on this continent? A people whose presence preceded the ancestors of the present nations? Do you think the long memory of country preserves real historical traces of those who came before, encoded in dreaming stories and ceremonial practices and the careful avoidance of certain places? Or do you think the standard account is essentially correct, and that the various puzzles we have looked at tonight can all be resolved within the framework of a single continuous Aboriginal presence stretching back 65,000 years or more? Where do you stand on the deepest question of Australian prehistory? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We genuinely want to hear what you make of all this. And if you have made it all the way to the end of tonight's long quiet walk, take a final moment to subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so, and to tap the like button to help others find this kind of slow, careful exploration of the world's deepest mysteries. The channel grows through your small acts of support. Every comment, every share, every quiet thumbs up helps us keep producing content like this. Content that takes the time to walk slowly through difficult questions and to listen carefully to the country and the traditions that hold its memory. Sleep well tonight. Let the images we have walked through settle into your mind like sand at the bottom of a deep pool. Let the figures on the Kimberley sandstone dance quietly in your dreams. Let the bunyip rest in its waterhole, watching but not moving. Let the doula gull sit in the deep gully, calm and patient, listening to the rain in the eucalyptus leaves. Let the Wandjina watch over the country with their great dark eyes. Let the lost coast lie quietly beneath the sea. Let the old people, whoever they were, walk softly through their old country with the dignity that they have always carried. And let yourself sink into a long, deep, restful sleep, surrounded by the immense patient presence of the oldest continent in the world. Wherever you are tonight, in whatever country, in whatever room, in whatever quiet corner of the night you have found for yourself, take one slow breath in and one slow breath out. The world is older than we usually remember. The country is patient. The voices of those who came before are still here, in the wind, in the stone, in the quiet hour just before dawn. They are not gone. They are simply waiting for us to slow down enough to hear them. And the continent itself, with its red interior and its long coast and its drowned shelves and its painted shelters and its silent gullies and its ancient buried fires, will go on holding its memory for as long as there is country to hold it. And beyond that, into the deep silence that follows when even the country has finally fallen asleep. Until we walk together again, may your sleep be deep, may your dreams be gentle, and may the long memory of the old country continue to hold you quietly through the dark and into the soft first light of the morning. Good night from all of us. Good night from the deep continent. Good night from the country that remembers more than any of us can ever quite manage to say. Sleep well.